From the recovered journal of Guard Captain Heinrich Müller, the sack of Rome was supposed to be over. Emperor Charles V's mercenaries had withdrawn after months of pillaging, leaving behind a city of ghosts and ash. Pope Clement VII had returned to the Vatican, and we Swiss guards were tasked with restoring order to the sacred halls that had witnessed unspeakable horrors. I should have died with my brothers on the steps of St. Peter's that terrible May morning. 473 Swiss guards gave their lives protecting the Pope's escape through the Passetto di Borgo. By some cruel twist of fate, I survived trapped beneath the bodies of my fallen comrades for 3 days, drinking rainwater that tasted of blood. When I finally crawled free, Rome was a charnel house. The imperial soldiers had desecrated everything holy, turning churches into stables and using sacred vestments as rags. But it was what I found in the Vatican's lower chambers that still haunts my dreams 30 years later. The Holy Father assigned me to catalog the damage in the Apostolic Archive. Most of the ancient texts had been scattered or burned, but in the deepest vault, I discovered something the looters had missed. Behind a false wall, marked only with symbols I didn't recognize, lay a collection of documents bound in what looked like human skin. The leather was wrong, too pale, too smooth, with what appeared to be fingernail marks scratched into its surface. Inside were testimonies written in Latin, Greek, and languages I couldn't identify. They spoke of things that walked the Vatican halls at night, of guards who had vanished during their watch, and of sounds echoing from chambers that had been sealed for centuries. One document, dated 1503, described a Swiss guard named Klaus who had been found in the Sistine Chapel at dawn, aged 50 years overnight. His hair had turned white, his face lined with wrinkles, but most disturbing of all, he could only speak backwards, as if time itself had reversed inside his throat. I should have reported my findings immediately. Instead, I read on. The accounts detailed a pattern stretching back to the Vatican's founding. Every few decades, during periods of great turmoil, something would awaken in the deepest foundations of St. Peter's Basilica. Guards would report seeing figures in the shadows not quite human, dressed in the robes of ancient cardinals, their faces hidden beneath hoods that seemed to absorb light. These entities, the documents claimed, were bound to the Vatican by rituals performed by Pope Sylvester I in the 4th century. They were meant to be protectors, guardians of secrets too terrible for mortal minds. But they demanded a price: the souls of those who stood watch in the darkest hours. As I read, the temperature in the vault began to drop. My breath misted in the air, and the candles I had brought flickered without any wind. I told myself it was merely the underground chambers playing tricks, but then I heard footsteps echoing from somewhere deeper in the archive, where no passage was supposed to exist. The sound was wrong. Each footfall seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if whoever was walking existed in several places simultaneously. I grabbed my halberd and followed the noise, though every instinct screamed at me to flee. The footsteps led me to a section of wall that looked identical to all the others, but when I placed my hand against it, the stone was ice cold and seemed to pulse with a rhythm like a heartbeat. The sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a whisper so faint I might have imagined it. Heinrich, my name, spoken in the voice of my brother guard, Marco, who had died beside me on the basilica steps. The voice came from within the wall itself. I stumbled backward, my halberd clattering to the floor. In the dancing candlelight, I saw something that made my blood freeze. The wall was bleeding thin rivulets of dark liquid seeping through the stones, pooling on the ancient floor. But it wasn't blood. As I watched in horror, the liquid began to move with purpose, forming letters on the ground. The watch continues. I ran. God forgive me. I abandoned my post and ran through those corridors like a madman, the ancient documents clutched to my chest. Behind me, I could hear the footsteps again, but now they were keeping pace with my own frantic flight. When I finally burst into the main halls of the Vatican, dawn was breaking through the windows. The nightmare was over, or so I thought. But as I turned to look back at the entrance to the archives, I saw them. 3 figures stood in the doorway, wearing the traditional striped uniforms of the Swiss Guard, but their faces were wrong. Too pale, too still, with eyes that reflected light like a cat's. They watched me for a long moment, then simply faded away, like morning mist. I reported none of this to His Holiness. Instead, I burned the documents I had found and requested an immediate transfer to the Day Watch. My request was granted without question, perhaps because I was not the first to make such a plea, but even now, 3 decades later, I cannot shake the memory of that night. Sometimes, when I walk past the archives during my rounds, I catch a glimpse of movement in the shadows. And in the deepest hours before dawn, when the Vatican is wrapped in silence, I still hear them, the footsteps of my fallen brothers, eternally walking their watch in chambers that exist between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The Swiss Guard's oath is sacred. We pledge our lives to protect the Holy Father and the Church, but some oaths, I have learned, extend far beyond death. And in the Vatican's ancient halls, the night watch never truly ends. Captain Heinrich Müller died in his sleep in 1557. Guards found his body in the barracks, perfectly preserved and showing no signs of age or illness. His final journal entry, dated the night before his death, consisted of a single line repeated 147 times. The watch continues. Transcript recovered from Vatican's secret archives. Classified until 2045. I need to write this down before they make me forget. Dr. Marchetti says the electroshock therapy will begin tomorrow, that it will help me recover from my trauma. But I know the truth, they want to erase what I saw in the Pope's private chapel that October night. My name is Alessandro Toretti. I have served in the Swiss Guard for 8 years, with a spotless record and 3 commendations for bravery. I was hand-selected for the Pontifical Guard, the most elite unit responsible for the Holy Father's personal security. Until last month, I believed myself to be a rational man, devoted to God and duty. That belief died when I witnessed Pope Paul VI perform the ritual. It began with the screaming. I was standing watch outside the Holy Father's private study when I heard what sounded like a child crying somewhere deep within the papal apartments. The sound was muffled but persistent, a keening wail that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I followed protocol and immediately contacted my superior, Captain Moeller, but received no response on the radio. The crying grew louder, more desperate. Against regulations, I made the decision to investigate. My oath required me to protect the Pope above all else, even if it meant entering his private chambers without permission. I found the source in a room I didn't know existed, a circular chamber hidden behind what appeared to be a solid wall in the study. The entrance was concealed so perfectly that I would never have found it if not for the fact that it stood slightly ajar, allowing the terrible sounds to escape. What I saw through that crack in the wall will haunt me for whatever remains of my life. The Pope knelt at the center of an intricate pattern carved into the black marble floor. The design was not Christian. It resembled something from the forbidden texts I had glimpsed during my theological studies, symbols that predated Christ by millennia. 12 candles arranged in a perfect circle provided the only light, their flames burning an unnatural shade of deep purple. But it was not the pagan symbols or the blasphemous candles that froze my blood. It was what the Holy Father held in his hands. A child no more than 6 or 7 years old lay motionless in his arms. The boy's skin was pale as parchment, his eyes closed, and I could see no rise or fall of breath in his small chest. The Pope was chanting in a language I didn't recognize, his voice carrying an authority I had never heard in his public masses. As he spoke, the child's body began to change. The pale skin grew translucent, revealing a network of dark veins underneath. The boy's lips parted, and something that was not breath escaped, a thin, black vapor that coiled in the air before being drawn into the Pope's own mouth. I watched in paralyzed horror as the Holy Father continued this obscene communion, his chants growing more intense. With each inhalation of the dark mist, Pope Paul VI seemed to grow younger. Lines faded from his face, his stooped posture straightened, and his white hair began to show streaks of its former brown. The child's body continued to wither, desiccating like fruit left too long in the sun. Within minutes, nothing remained but a husk of leathery skin stretched over bones, and still the Pope continued his ritual. When the last wisp of vapor had been consumed, the Holy Father carefully placed the remains in what I now realized was a small coffin hidden in the shadows. It was not the first such box I could see in the chamber's corners. I must have made some sound, a gasp, a sob, I cannot remember which. But the Pope's head snapped up, and his eyes met mine through the crack in the door. Those eyes. They were not the kind, grandfatherly eyes of the man who blessed crowds in St. Peter's Square. They were ancient, hungry, and utterly without mercy. "Come," he said in a voice like grinding stone. "You have seen. Now you must choose." I found myself walking into that horrible chamber, my body moving without conscious thought. The Pope rose from his kneeling position with the fluid grace of a man a quarter his age, and I could see that the transformation was real. The ritual had literally drained years from his life back into his aging flesh. "Do you know how long the Church has endured, my son?" he asked, circling me like a predator. "Empires rise and fall, plagues sweep the earth, wars consume nations, but the Church remains. Do you think this is mere chance?" I tried to speak, to ask him about the child, but no words would come. The symbols carved into the floor seemed to pulse with their own malevolent light, and I could feel something pressing against my mind, trying to worm its way inside. "The Church serves a higher purpose," the Pope continued. "We are the guardians of humanity's greatest secret, that God abandoned this world long ago, and something else took his place. The entity we serve demands sacrifice, but in return, it grants us the power to shepherd mankind through the darkness." He gestured to the small coffins lining the chamber walls, and I realized with sick horror that there were dozens of them. "These children were already lost," he said, noting my gaze. "Orphans, runaways, the forgotten ones. Their brief suffering purchases centuries of guidance for billions. It is a mathematics of mercy that smaller minds cannot comprehend." The Pope placed a withered hand on my shoulder, and I felt a cold that went deeper than flesh, deeper than bone. "You have witnessed the truth behind the Vatican's power. Now you must decide, will you join us in our sacred work, or will you join the children?" For a moment that lasted an eternity, I stood at the crossroads between damnation and a different kind of hell. I thought of my oath, of my faith, of everything I had believed about God and good and the nature of the world. Then I thought of my sister Maria, dead of cancer at age 9, and how I had prayed every night for God to save her. I remembered my mother weeping at the funeral, asking why the Almighty would take such an innocent soul. Perhaps I was a coward. Perhaps I was simply broken. But when the Pope asked for my answer, I nodded. The initiation that followed is burned into my memory in fragments. I remember signing documents in my own blood, speaking words in that same unknown language, and feeling something dark and hungry settling into my soul like ice in my veins. When it was over, I was no longer merely Alessandro Toretti, Swiss Guard. I was a keeper of the Church's most terrible secret. For 3 weeks, I continued my duties as if nothing had changed. But the knowledge ate at me like acid. Every time I saw the Pope blessing children in the square, I wondered which of them would end up in that underground chamber. Every night, I lay awake listening for the sound of crying in the walls. The breaking point came during the Pope's private audience with a delegation from the Red Cross. Among them was a young photographer documenting their relief work with orphans in Bangladesh. She was maybe 25, with kind eyes and a laugh that reminded me of my sister. That night, I heard the crying again. I found myself walking toward the hidden chamber, knowing what I would find but unable to stop myself. The Pope was there, as I knew he would be, kneeling in the center of his blasphemous circle, and in his arms, the photographer lay motionless, her camera broken beside her on the floor. But she was not a child, I told myself desperately. The ritual should not work on an adult. I was wrong. As I watched through the crack in the door, her body began the same horrible transformation I had witnessed before. But this time, something went wrong. Instead of the peaceful dissolution I had seen with the child, the young woman's eyes snapped open. She was awake, aware, as her life force was slowly drained away. Her mouth opened in a soundless scream, her eyes finding mine across the chamber. In them, I saw not just terror, but a plea, a desperate begging for help that I was too much of a coward to answer. The Pope never paused in his chanting, even as the woman's silent screams grew more desperate. When it was over, when she was nothing but another desiccated husk for another small coffin, he turned to me with satisfaction gleaming in his rejuvenated features. "She fought well," he said approvingly. "The strong ones always provide more nourishment." That was when I broke. I ran through the Vatican halls screaming about murder and blasphemy and the Holy Father's terrible secret. The Swiss Guard captain found me in the Sistine Chapel, cowering beneath Michelangelo's depiction of the Last Judgment, and babbling about children in coffins and popes who fed on souls. They told me I had suffered a nervous breakdown, brought on by the stress of my duties. Dr. Marchetti, the Vatican's private psychiatrist, diagnosed me with acute psychosis and recommended immediate treatment. My family was informed that I had become delusional, imagining impossible conspiracies against the Church. But I know what I saw. I know what the Pope truly is, what the Vatican has been hiding for centuries. And I know that tomorrow, when they run electricity through my brain, they will try to make me forget. So I write this testimony as my final act of defiance. I pray that someone, someday, will find these words and understand the truth. The Catholic Church is not what it pretends to be. The Pope is not God's representative on earth. He is something else entirely. And in the hidden chambers beneath St. Peter's Basilica, the crying never stops. Alessandro Toretti died during electroshock therapy on November 15, 1978. Pope Paul VI died less than 2 months later, on August 6, 1978, at the age of 80. Vatican records indicate that Toretti's written testimony was destroyed as part of his therapeutic treatment, though a single copy was apparently preserved in the secret archives. The authenticity of this document remains disputed. Audio transcript recovered from Guard Tower C, Vatican City. Static wind noise. Recording begins mid-sentence. Testing. Okay. This piece of shit recorder is finally working. This is Guard Corporal Marcus Weber. Tower C Night Watch. October 31st, 1981. Approximately 200 hours. I'm making this recording because, Christ, I don't even know how to explain what's been happening. Pause. Sound of lighter clicking. I've been stationed at the Vatican for 3 years now. Good record. No disciplinary actions. Commended twice for vigilance during papal audiences. I'm telling you this because what I'm about to describe is going to sound like the ravings of a madman, and I need whoever finds this tape to understand that I was sane when I started my shift tonight. Long pause. Sound of paper rustling. Let me start from the beginning. My watch began at 2000 hours 8 p.m. for you civilians who might be listening to this someday. Standard night patrol of the outer perimeter. Nothing unusual. The weather was typical for late October, cold, overcast, with that weird mist that seems to rise from the Tiber after sunset. Around 2130, I was making my rounds near the old wall when I noticed something off about Tower B. The guard stationed there, Hoffman, good Swiss boy from Zurich, wasn't responding to radio checks. At first, I figured maybe his equipment was malfunctioning. Happens more often than the brass likes to admit. But when I looked through my binoculars, I could see him clearly in his position. He was standing at attention, facing outward toward the city, just like he should be. But something about his posture was wrong. Too rigid, like a statue instead of a living man. Sound of metal creaking, footsteps. Sorry, just checking the courtyard. Where was I? Right, Hoffman. I tried raising him on the radio again. Nothing. So I made the decision to leave my post and investigate. I know, against regulations. But if one of our own was in trouble, the walk to Tower B takes about 4 minutes across the inner courtyard. As I got closer, I could see that Hoffman was indeed standing upright, but he hadn't moved a muscle, not even when I called out to him from the base of the tower. The door to his guard post was locked from the inside, which was protocol, but he should have responded when I knocked. I used my master key and climbed the narrow stone steps to the top. Long pause. Sound of heavy breathing. Jesus Christ. Even now, hours later, I can barely. Hoffman was dead. Had to be. No living person could stand like that, with their back arched at that angle, head tilted back so far I could see the whites of his eyes. But here's the thing. He was still warm. Body temperature felt normal. No rigor mortis. Pupils still reactive to light. By every medical standard I could think of, the man was alive. But he wasn't breathing. And when I checked for a pulse, nothing. His radio was working fine. I tested it myself. But Hoffman couldn't hear me, couldn't respond, couldn't move. It was like something had switched him off while leaving his body running on automatic. I should have called for backup immediately. Should have reported to Captain Mueller. But something kept me from using the radio. Call it instinct, call it cowardice. But I had the overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. Not just by Hoffman's frozen eyes, but by something else. Static burst. Unclear voices in background. What the hell was that? Hold on. Footsteps. Sound of door opening and closing. Nothing there. Must be interference from the radio tower. But for a second, it sounded like, never mind. Back to Hoffman. I decided to stay with him until morning. Figure out what to do when the day shift arrived. That's when things really started getting weird. Around midnight, Hoffman began to speak. Not with his voice, his mouth never moved, his throat never worked. But I could hear words coming from somewhere inside him, like he was a radio picking up a distant transmission. At first, it was just fragments. Latin phrases I recognized from Mass, mixed with what sounded like German prayers. But gradually, the voice became clearer, more distinct. And I realized it wasn't Hoffman's voice at all. It was speaking in Swiss German, the specific dialect from my hometown of St. Moritz. The voice was familiar, though I couldn't place it at first. Then it said my name, Marcus. Marcus Weber. Long pause. Sound of cigarette being lit. The voice belonged to my grandfather, Hans Weber. He died when I was 12, but I'd recognize that gravelly tone anywhere. He'd been a mountain guide in the Alps, killed in an avalanche, while leading a rescue party to find lost climbers. Grandfather, I whispered to Hoffman's motionless form, is that really you? Marcus, you must listen carefully, the voice continued, seeming to come from Hoffman's chest. This place, this holy ground, it is not what you think. What followed was the most terrifying conversation of my life. My grandfather's voice, speaking through my fellow guard's body, told me things about the Vatican that no living person should know. He spoke of chambers beneath St. Peter's Basilica that don't appear on any architectural plans, rooms filled with artifacts that predate Christianity by thousands of years, and in the deepest vault, something that the Church has been guarding and feeding for over a millennium. The Swiss Guard's true purpose, my grandfather's voice explained, is not to protect the Pope from earthly threats. You are sentries for something far older and more terrible. Every few years, the entity grows hungry, and guards are chosen to satisfy its appetite. I wanted to believe it was all hallucination, stress-induced madness brought on by finding my colleague in that impossible state. But then my grandfather began describing things only he could know, family secrets, childhood memories we had shared, even the exact words of a promise he made to me on his deathbed. Sound of wind picking up? Papers rustling? The wind's getting stronger. Storm must be coming in from the north. According to my grandfather, the selection process had already begun. Guards would be found in catatonic states, their consciousness pulled away to serve as conduits for the dead. Through them, the entity would speak, testing the living guard's loyalty and faith. You have been chosen, Marcus, the voice said. Soon you will join us in eternal service. That's when I noticed the other towers. Through the windows of the guard post, I could see across the Vatican complex to towers A, D, and E. In each one, I could make out the silhouette of a guard standing at rigid attention, motionless as statues, all of them positioned identically to Hoffman. All of them dead but still standing watch. Sound of radio crackling? Christ, there it goes again. The radio keeps picking up the voices. Lots of voices, all speaking at once. I can't make out individual words, but they sound hungry. Pause, sound of heavy breathing. I tried to leave Tower B around 100. Tried to get back to my own post. Call for help. Report what was happening. But the door wouldn't open. The lock mechanism worked fine from the inside, but something was holding the door shut from the outside. I was trapped with Hoffman's body and my grandfather's voice for the next hour. During that time, I learned more about the Vatican's history than any civilian or low-ranking guard ever should. The entity beneath St. Peter's is old, older than Rome, older than recorded history. It was here when the first Christians arrived, and it made a bargain with them. Protection and power in exchange for regular offerings of life and soul. The Swiss Guard was established not just as the Pope's bodyguards, but as a renewable source of tribute. Strong young men, far from home, bound by oaths of absolute loyalty. Every few decades, when the entity's hunger grows too great, guards would be called to a special vigil. They would descend into the deepest chambers beneath the basilica, and most would never return. Those who did emerge were changed. Their eyes held knowledge that mortal minds weren't meant to possess, and they served as intermediaries between the church hierarchy and their ancient patron. "The time has come again," my grandfather's voice warned. "The Holy Father has chosen you and your brothers for the next offering. Tomorrow night, you will be summoned to the depths." Static burst. Multiple voices overlapping. The radio interference is getting worse. I keep hearing names being called, guards I know, guards I've served with. And underneath it all, something else. A sound like chanting? No, that's not right. It's more like singing, but in frequencies that make my teeth ache. Long pause. I managed to get the door open about 20 minutes ago. Don't ask me how 1 second it was stuck fast, the next it swung freely. I should have run then, should have fled the Vatican and never looked back. But where could I go? My oath binds me to this place, and something tells me that oath extends far beyond the mortal realm. Instead, I'm back in my own tower, making this recording. If anyone finds this tape, if I don't survive whatever's coming, know this: the Vatican is not the holy sanctuary the world believes it to be. There are things in the church's shadows that make demons look like angels, and in less than 24 hours, I'm going to meet one of them face to face. Sound of footsteps on stone. Someone's coming. Multiple sets of footsteps in the courtyard below. I can see them now, 12 guards in full dress uniform, carrying torches instead of flashlights. They're moving in formation toward the main basilica. Wait, one of them is Hoffman. But that's impossible. I left him standing motionless in Tower B not an hour ago. Yet, there he is, walking with the others like nothing happened. They're stopping beneath my tower, looking up at me. Jesus Christ, their eyes. Their eyes are reflecting the torchlight like animals. And they're smiling, all of them smiling the same terrible, knowing smile. Captain Muller is with them. He's calling my name, telling me to come down. Says it's time for my special assignment. Pause. Sound of wind? I know what this is. It's the summoning my grandfather warned me about. The vigil of the chosen guards. I can try to run, but where? The Vatican is surrounded by walls, and even if I escaped, they'd find me. The oath I swore binds me to obedience. I'm going to stop the recording now. Hide the tape where hopefully someone will find it someday. If you're listening to this, know that the Swiss Guards motto, Acriter et Fideliter, takes on a whole new meaning when you understand who we really serve. Courage and faithfulness. We serve with both until the very end. Sound of footsteps. Descending stairs. Captain Muller? Yes, sir, I'm coming. Just had to secure my post. Sound of door opening. Voices in the distance. Recording continues faintly. Marcus Weber, reporting as ordered. Ready for special assignment. Very good, Corporal. Follow us. The Holy Father is waiting. Footsteps on stone. Voices fading. Static. Recording ends at 347 hours. Attached note. Corporal Marcus Weber was reported missing from his post on November 1981. Vatican security conducted a thorough search of the grounds but found no trace of the guard or any evidence of disturbance. His personal effects, including this audio cassette, were discovered in his quarters 3 days later. Weber was officially listed as AWOL and discharged in absentia. The authenticity of this recording has never been verified, and Vatican spokespeople have declined to comment on its contents. Handwritten pages found sealed within the walls of the Swiss Guard barracks during renovations. I am writing this in the last hours before dawn, hidden in a maintenance shaft between the barracks walls where they cannot find me. My name is Brother Thomas Kessler, and I have served the Vatican Swiss Guard for 7 years. In 6 hours, when the sun rises on November 20, All Souls' Day, I will either be dead or something worse than dead. This is my testament. If God wills that someone should find these pages, let them serve as warning to any who would seek to uncover the truth behind the Holy See's most guarded secrets. I was not supposed to survive the vigil. 3 days ago, I was selected along with 11 other guards for what Captain Brennan called special liturgical duties in honor of All Saints' Day. We were told to report to the old entrance of St. Peter's at midnight, dressed in our ceremonial uniforms and carrying our blessed halberds. It was presented as an honor, a chance to participate in ancient traditions dating back to the earliest days of the Swiss Guard. We should have known better. In 7 years of service, I had never heard of such a ceremony. But the Guard teaches absolute obedience, and when your superiors speak with the authority of the church behind them, questioning becomes impossible. The 12 of us assembled at the appointed time. I recognized most of my companions, good men, faithful Catholics who had served with distinction. Müller from Bern, who had saved a child from drowning in the Tiber during a papal audience. Hoffmann from Zurich, whose devotion to the morning mass was legendary among the guards. Fischer from Basel, who sent half his pay home to support his widowed mother. All of us chosen for reasons we would soon understand. Captain Brennan met us at the basilica's ancient entrance, accompanied by 2 figures I had never seen before. They wore the robes of cardinals, but their faces were hidden deep within their hoods. When they spoke, their voices seemed to come from a great distance, echoing strangely in the night air. "Brothers," one of them intoned, "you have been selected to participate in the Church's most sacred mystery. Tonight, you will learn the true foundation upon which St. Peter's has stood for over 1,500 years." They led us down passages I had never seen, though I thought I knew every inch of the Vatican. Stone steps worn smooth by centuries of footsteps spiraled down into the earth, far deeper than the traditional crypts where the popes are entombed. The air grew colder with each level we descended, and our torches, for we carried no electric lights, cast dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames. After what felt like hours of descent, we emerged into a vast underground chamber. The ceiling stretched up into darkness beyond the reach of our torchlight, supported by columns that were clearly not Roman or Christian in origin. The stone was different here, black and smooth, carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. At the center of the chamber stood an altar. It was not like any Christian altar I had ever seen. The base was a solid block of that same dark stone, but the surface was polished metal that reflected our torchlight with an oily rainbow sheen. Channels had been carved into the metal's surface, forming intricate patterns that all led to a central depression. Around the altar, 12 stone chairs had been arranged in a perfect circle. Each chair bore carvings of a different animal. I could make out a lion, an eagle, a serpent, and others that seemed to shift and change in the flickering light. "Sit," commanded one of the hooded cardinals. We obeyed, each guard taking a chair seemingly at random. Only later would I realize that our positions had been carefully predetermined. As I settled onto the cold stone, I felt something give way beneath me, mechanisms built into the chair that I was too terrified to examine closely. The moment all 12 of us were seated, the chamber began to change. What I had taken for natural stone walls revealed themselves to be something else entirely. In the torchlight, I could now see that we were surrounded by niches carved into the rock, thousands of them, stretching up into the darkness above. And in each niche lay the remains of a human figure. Not skeletons, these bodies had been preserved somehow, mummified into leathery approximations of their former selves. They wore the uniforms of Swiss guards from different eras. I could trace the evolution of our dress through the centuries just by looking at the preserved corpses around us. But it was their faces that made my blood turn to ice. Every one of them bore an expression of absolute terror, mouths open in eternal screams, eye sockets dark and empty. These men had died in agony, and something had kept them from finding peace even in death. "Behold," said the second cardinal, throwing back his hood to reveal a face that was ancient beyond measure. The true guardians of the church. The face was human, but wrong in ways I struggled to describe. The skin was pale as parchment, and seemed to have no pores or blemishes, perfect and lifeless as a mask. The eyes were the worst part. Completely black, like looking into deep water at night, and when he smiled, his teeth were too sharp and too numerous. "Every generation," he continued, "the church requires renewal. Fresh blood to feed the ancient compact that has kept us strong through plague, war, and the rise and fall of empires. You 12 have been chosen to join your predecessors in eternal service." The chairs began to move. Metal restraints, hidden within the stone, snapped around our wrists and ankles with mechanical precision. I struggled against the bonds, as did my fellow guards, but the restraints were too strong and too well designed. We were trapped, arranged around the altar like offerings to some pagan god. The first cardinal began to chant in a language that predated Latin, predated any human tongue I had ever heard. The words seemed to bypass my ears entirely, vibrating through the stone floor and into my bones. The altar began to glow with that same oily, shifting light I had noticed earlier. One by one, my fellow guards began to scream. It started with Muller, seated directly across from me. His body went rigid against the restraints, his back arching in obvious agony. But what was happening to him was worse than mere physical pain. I could see something, leaving him a faint, luminescent vapor that rose from his skin like steam from hot blood in winter air. The vapor was drawn inexorably toward the altar, where it pooled in the central depression and began to pulse with a rhythm like a heartbeat. With each wisp that was torn from Muller's body, he aged visibly. His hair turned gray, then white, then fell out entirely. His face collapsed. The brass clock in the Apostolic Palace struck midnight as Giovanni Marchetti adjusted his grip on his ceremonial halberd. 6 months into his service as a Swiss guard, he had grown accustomed to the weight of the ancient weapon. But tonight, something felt different. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more oppressive than usual. Giovanni stood at his post outside the papal apartments, his colorful Renaissance uniform a stark contrast to the darkness that pressed against the windows. The Vatican at night was a labyrinth of whispered prayers and flickering candles, but tonight even those comforting sounds seemed muffled, as if the very walls were holding their breath. It was during his 3rd hour of watch that Giovanni first heard the footsteps. They came from the direction of the Sistine Chapel, echoing softly through the marble corridors. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to pause at irregular intervals, as if the walker were studying something along the way. Giovanni straightened, his training kicking in automatically. No one should be wandering the halls at this hour without authorization. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by what sounded like the whisper of fabric against stone. Giovanni called out in Italian, his voice carrying the authority of his oath. "Chi va là? State yourself." The footsteps stopped. In the silence that followed, Giovanni could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. He waited, every muscle tense, for a response that never came. After what felt like an eternity, he heard the footsteps resume, but now they seemed to be moving away, back toward the chapel. Protocol demanded that Giovanni remain at his post, unless directly threatened or ordered otherwise. But something about those footsteps, the way they had paused when he called out, then deliberately retreated, filled him with a sense of wrongness that gnawed at his chest. The next night brought the same mysterious visitor. This time, Giovanni was ready. He had spoken with his captain during the day shift change, reporting the incident. Captain Mueller, a 20-year veteran of the guard, had listened with the patient expression of a man who had heard similar stories before. "The Vatican is old, Marchetti," Mueller had said, his German accent thick despite decades of Italian service. "Old buildings make strange sounds, pipes settling, wood expanding, mice in the walls. You'll learn to distinguish between real threats and phantom ones." But Giovanni knew what he had heard wasn't pipes or mice. As midnight approached, he found himself straining to catch the first hint of those deliberate footsteps. They came again, right on schedule. This time, however, Giovanni noticed something else. The temperature in the corridor had dropped noticeably, and his breath began to mist in small puffs before his face. More unsettling still, the footsteps seemed to be accompanied by a faint scratching sound, like fingernails dragging against stone. When the walker reached the same spot where it had stopped the previous night, Giovanni saw something that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. At the far end of the corridor, just barely visible in the dim light cast by the emergency lighting, a shadow moved across the wall. But there was no one there to cast it. The shadow was tall and impossibly thin, with elongated limbs that seemed to bend at unnatural angles. As Giovanni watched in horrified fascination, it turned toward him, and he could swear he saw the outline of a face, sunken cheeks, hollow eye sockets, and a mouth that hung open in what might have been a scream or a plea. "Madonna Santissima," Giovanni whispered, crossing himself with his free hand. The shadow froze at the sound of his voice, then began to move toward him with that same deliberate pace. But now Giovanni could see that it wasn't walking. It was gliding, flowing along the wall like spilled ink. Every instinct screamed at Giovanni to run, but his oath held him fast. He was sworn to protect this place, and the Holy Father who slept beyond these doors. No matter what unholy thing approached him, he would not abandon his post. The shadow drew closer, and with it came a smell that made Giovanni's stomach lurch. The sickly, sweet scent of flowers left too long in a tomb, mixed with something else, something organic and wrong. The temperature continued to drop, and frost began to form on the marble walls. When the shadow was perhaps 20 feet away, it stopped. Giovanni found himself staring into what he now realized were definitely eyes. Dark, hungry things that seemed to bore into his soul. The mouth opened wider, and a sound emerged that was neither voice nor wind, but something that bypassed the ears entirely and resonated in the bones. "Why do you guard the guilty?" The words formed in Giovanni's mind without passing through his ears. They carried with them images, flashes of scenes he couldn't quite understand, but that filled him with revulsion. Stone chambers deep beneath the Vatican, robed figures gathered around something that writhed and pleaded, the taste of copper and the sound of Latin chanted in reverse. "You know what lies beneath. You know what they protect. Why do you stand guard over their sins?" Giovanni's grip on his halberd tightened until his knuckles went white. "I guard the Holy Father," he managed to whisper through lips that felt numb with cold. "I guard the church." The shadow's laugh was like breaking glass, mixed with children's sobs. "The church? Is that what you call this place of secrets and shame? Look deeper, little soldier. Look beneath the marble and gold. See what your precious church builds its foundation upon." More images flooded Giovanni's mind, older this time, reaching back through centuries. He saw Swiss guards like himself standing at attention, while unspeakable acts were committed in their presence. He saw cardinals blessing instruments of torture. He saw popes who smiled benedictions over crowds while their hands were stained with innocent blood. "No," Giovanni said, his voice growing stronger. "These are lies. Temptations, are they? Then explain the sounds that come from beneath the basilica when the moon is dark. Explain the rooms that appear on no map. Explain why the walls weep blood on certain nights, and why the gardeners find bones in the rose beds." Giovanni's faith wavered for a moment, but only a moment. He had heard stories. Whispered rumors passed between guards in the small hours of their shifts. Tales of things that didn't belong in a holy place, of ceremonies that weren't found in any missal, of visitors who came and went through tunnels that officially didn't exist. But faith wasn't about certainty. Faith was about standing firm when certainty crumbled. "I know what I swore to protect," Giovanni said, raising his halberd, "and I know what you are. Get back to whatever hell spawned you." The shadow's form rippled with rage, growing larger and more distinct. Now Giovanni could see other shapes moving within it, the outlines of faces twisted in anguish, hands reaching out in supplication or accusation. "You will see," the thing hissed. "Before your service ends, you will see the truth. And when you do, you will understand that we are not the monsters here." The shadow began to recede, flowing backward along the wall like a film played in reverse. But its eyes never left Giovanni's face, and its final words echoed in his mind long after the corridor had returned to its normal temperature. "We are the witnesses. We are the testament to their crimes. And one day, little soldier, you will join us." Giovanni remained at his post until the morning shift arrived, though he spent the remaining hours fighting waves of nausea and the persistent feeling that he was being watched from every shadowy corner. When Captain Muller asked for his report, Giovanni found himself hesitating. How could he explain what he had experienced? How could he put into words the certainty that he had encountered something genuinely evil, not the cartoon devil of medieval art, but something far more terrible because it might be telling the truth? In the end, he reported nothing unusual. But that night marked the beginning of Giovanni's real education in the mysteries of Vatican City. Over the following weeks, he began to notice things he had previously overlooked. Certain doors that were always locked, always guarded, with no explanation given to the junior guards. Deliveries that arrived at odd hours, carried by men who spoke no Italian and met no one's eyes. The way conversation stopped when he entered certain rooms, and the look that passed between senior guards when they thought no one was watching. Most disturbing of all were the sounds that drifted up through the ventilation system during his night watches. Sounds that might have been plumbing, but carried rhythms too regular, too purposeful. Sometimes there were voices mixed in, not the Latin of holy prayers, but something older, something that predated Christianity by millennia. Giovanni began to research the history of Vatican City, spending his off-duty hours in the library, following footnotes and references that led deeper and deeper into the past. What he found there shook the foundations of his faith more thoroughly than any shadow demon ever could. The Vatican had been built on the site of Nero's circus, where countless Christians had been martyred. But before Nero, the hill had been sacred to other, darker gods. Archaeological surveys mentioned repeatedly in the oldest documents had found evidence of sacrificial altars, ritual chambers, and mass graves that suggested ceremonies far removed from anything the Romans officially practiced. More troubling still were the references to events from within the Church's own history, papal bulls that had been mysteriously rescinded, cardinals who had vanished without explanation, and incidents that were mentioned in one document only to be contradicted or omitted entirely in others. The pattern that emerged was one of an institution that had spent centuries carefully burying its own past, layer upon layer, like geological strata of secrets. Giovanni's investigation might have remained an academic exercise if not for the night he decided to follow the source of those underground sounds. It was during a shift change, in the brief window, when corridors that were never truly unguarded experienced a few minutes of relative privacy. Giovanni slipped away from his assigned route and made his way to a maintenance door he had noticed during his research, one that appeared on architectural plans from the 1930s, but had been omitted from all subsequent blueprints. The door was locked, but Giovanni had learned a few skills during his military service that weren't part of official Swiss Guard training. Within minutes, he was descending a staircase that shouldn't have existed, following the sound of chanting that grew stronger with each step. The passages beneath the Vatican were older than he had imagined possible. The walls were carved from living rock and decorated with symbols that definitely weren't Christian. Some he recognized from his research as Roman religious iconography, but others were completely alien, twisted geometries that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally, and faces that might have been human, if not for too many eyes or mouths, that opened in directions that defied anatomy. The chanting led him through a maze of tunnels and chambers, past rooms filled with artifacts that no museum would ever display. He saw altars stained dark with substances he didn't want to identify, shelves lined with books bound in materials that looked disturbingly like human skin, and cages that were sized for occupants larger than any animal he could name. Finally, he reached the source of the chanting. Through a crack in an ancient door, Giovanni peered into a chamber that belonged to his worst nightmares. Robed figures knelt in concentric circles around a pit that seemed to extend far deeper than the foundations of any building should allow. The pit was lined with symbols that hurt to look at directly, and from its depths came a light that was less illumination than it was the absence of darkness. The chanters weren't speaking Latin, or any language Giovanni recognized. The words seemed to crawl out of their mouths like living things, hanging in the air before being absorbed by whatever waited in the pit. And as Giovanni watched, that something began to respond. Tentacles the size of tree trunks emerged from the depths, followed by what might charitably be called a head. The thing that rose from the pit was ancient beyond measure, its flesh the color of old parchment, and covered in eyes that blinked in patterns that suggested an intelligence vast and utterly alien. The robed figures prostrated themselves as the entity's attention turned toward them. One of them, Giovanni recognized the voice as belonging to a cardinal he had served dinner to just the week before, began to speak in accented but clear English. The barriers weaken, Master. The old seals crack. Soon, the way will be open, and your dominion will extend beyond this small sanctuary we have maintained for you. The thing in the pit responded with a sound like breaking glaciers mixed with screaming wind. Somehow, Giovanni understood its meaning. The guardians above suspect nothing. The Swiss Guard sees only what we allow them to see. They are faithful dogs, trained to protect their masters without question. Even if one or two begin to wonder, they lack the will to act against us. Giovanni's blood turned to ice as the cardinal continued. There is one among the current rotation who has shown curiosity, Giovanni Marchetti. But he is young, and his faith is strong. He will not be a problem. The entity's laughter was like the sound of continents shifting. Bring him to me. I will show him wonders that will burn the doubt from his mind and replace it with proper servitude. As you wish, master. Giovanni didn't wait to hear more. He fled through the tunnels, no longer caring about stealth, concerned only with reaching the surface before something noticed his absence. Behind him, he could hear the chanting growing louder, more urgent, and underneath it, the sound of something very large beginning to move. He made it back to his post with minutes to spare before the shift change, but he knew his time was running out. The shadow creature had been right. The Vatican was built on foundations of horror that stretched back far beyond the birth of Christianity. And now those ancient horrors were stirring, preparing to reclaim a world that had forgotten their names. Giovanni's hands shook as he gripped his halberd, realizing that his ceremonial weapon was less protection than it was a cruel joke. How could steel and faith stand against powers that had been old when Rome was young? But as he stood there in the darkness, listening for footsteps that might herald his summons to the depths below, Giovanni made a decision that would define the remainder of his service. He would not go quietly into whatever nightmare awaited him. He would not become another silent guardian of unspeakable secrets. If his faith wasn't strong enough to protect the church from its own corruption, then perhaps it was strong enough to protect the world from what the church had become. The next morning, Giovanni began making copies of everything he had discovered. Documents, photographs, maps of the hidden passages. He secreted them in locations throughout Rome, with instructions for their release should anything happen to him. He also began reaching out to other guards, carefully feeling out their loyalties and their willingness to hear uncomfortable truths. What he found both heartened and terrified him. He was not the only one who had noticed discrepancies, who had heard rumors, who had begun to question what they were really protecting. The Swiss Guard, it seemed, contained within its ranks both the ultimate defenders of Vatican secrets and the seeds of its exposure. Giovanni never saw the shadow creature again, but he didn't need to. He understood now that it had been exactly what it claimed, a witness, a remnant of victims whose voices had been silenced but whose presence endured. The real horror wasn't the ghosts that haunted Vatican halls. The real horror was what had created those ghosts in the first place. As Giovanni continued his vigil night after night, he often wondered if he would live long enough to see his evidence reach the outside world. But whether he lived or died, whether his faith survived the revelations he had uncovered, he had found a purpose larger than his oath to any earthly institution. He would stand guard against the true enemies of humanity, even if they wore sacred vestments and spoke in holy languages, even if they were the very people he had sworn to protect. The brass nameplate on the confession booth read, Padre Benedetto Torretti, but the man behind that name had died 3 days ago in a hospital in Zurich. Captain Hans Weber of the Swiss Guard knew this because he had been the one to identify the body, and he had been the one to arrange for its quiet transportation back to Vatican City for burial in the priest's cemetery, which made the sight of Father Benedetto sitting in his usual confession booth at 11:47 p.m. particularly disturbing. Weber stood frozen in the doorway of St. Peter's Basilica, his hand instinctively moving to the sidearm that was hidden beneath his formal dress uniform. In 30 years of service to the Vatican, he had encountered many things that challenged his understanding of the natural world, but he had never been confronted with something this directly impossible. The old priest sat exactly as he always had during evening confession hours, slightly hunched forward, his silver hair catching the light from the votive candles, his hands folded peacefully in his lap. If not for the fact that Weber had personally watched those same hands being folded across a corpse's chest just 3 days earlier, the scene would have been entirely normal. Weber approached slowly, his footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness of the basilica. The few tourists who lingered during evening hours had been ushered out over an hour ago, and the cleaning crew wouldn't arrive until after midnight. By all rights, Weber should have been alone with the shadows and the ever-present weight of centuries of prayer that seemed to press down from the vaulted ceiling. "Father?" Weber called softly when he was still 20 feet from the confession booth. The figure didn't respond, didn't acknowledge his presence in any way. Weber moved closer, noting details that made his skin crawl. Father Benedetto's skin had a waxy quality that reminded him unpleasantly of the funeral parlor, and there was no visible rise and fall of his chest that would indicate breathing. "Father Benedetto?" Weber tried again, this time from just outside the booth. Now the figure did respond, but not in any way that provided comfort. Without lifting his head or opening his eyes, the priest began to speak in a voice that was simultaneously familiar and utterly wrong. "Captain Weber," the thing that looked like Father Benedetto said, "you've come for confession." It wasn't a question, and the tone carried an authority that seemed to bypass Weber's conscious mind and speak directly to something deeper, something that had been trained to obey clerical commands since childhood. Weber found himself sliding into the penitent's side of the booth before he had consciously decided to do so. The familiar smell of old wood and lingering incense surrounded him, but underneath those comfortable scents was something else. The cloying sweetness of flowers at a funeral, mixed with an organic decay that suggested meat left too long in summer heat. "I haven't come for confession, Father," Weber managed to say, his voice sounding strange in his own ears. "I came to investigate reports of unusual activity." "Unusual," the priest repeated, and Weber could hear something that might have been amusement in the word. "Yes, I suppose my presence here could be considered unusual. Tell me, Captain, what is the most unusual thing you've encountered during your service to the Holy See?" Weber's mouth opened to give a diplomatic non-answer, but found himself speaking the truth instead. "The Portelli incident in 1994, he heard himself say. Cardinal Portelli's private secretary was found in the Vatican gardens, completely drained of blood, but with no wounds on the body. The official report claimed death by natural causes, but I was one of the guards who found him. He was white as paper, and there were bite marks on his neck that looked wrong. Too big for human teeth, but too small for any animal that could have gotten into the gardens." "Ah, yes, poor Francesco." Father Benedetto's voice carried what sounded like genuine regret. He was asking too many questions about the night services. Cardinal Portelli felt that a demonstration was necessary to ensure continued discretion among the staff. Weber felt ice water flowing through his veins. "Night services? You know about the night services, Captain. You've stood guard during them many times, though you were told they were simply private prayers for the souls of the faithful departed. Tell me, did you never wonder why those particular prayer sessions required armed guards? Did you never question why the participants wore hoods, or why the ceremonies were conducted in Latin so archaic that even the Vatican's scholars struggled to translate it?" Weber's hands began to shake. He had indeed stood guard during what he had been told were special prayer vigils, usually held in the small chapel beneath the basilica that was officially used for storage. He had been instructed to ensure that no one entered or left during the ceremonies, and to report anyone who showed excessive curiosity about the proceedings. He had followed those orders without question, as he had been trained to do, but he remembered the sounds that had drifted from beneath the heavy wooden doors. Not the quiet murmur of prayer, but something that had reminded him uncomfortably of the slaughterhouses he had visited as a child in Switzerland. "Those weren't prayer services," Weber whispered. "No, they weren't. Would you like to know what they actually were? Would you like me to describe what your cardinals and bishops do when they think no one is watching? When they believe their faithful guardians are too obedient to question, too indoctrinated to doubt?" Weber wanted to say no, wanted to flee from the confession booth and never speak of this again. But the compulsion to hear the truth was stronger than his desire to preserve his comfortable ignorance. "Tell me," he said. Father Benedetto began to speak, and with his words came images that burned themselves into Weber's memory with the clarity of film projected directly onto his retinas. He saw the night services as they really were, gatherings of high-ranking church officials who gathered to worship entities that had been ancient, when Christianity was still a persecuted cult in the Roman Empire. He saw altars that had been carved from black stone and decorated with symbols that hurt to look at directly. He saw chalices filled with substances that definitely weren't wine, passed between participants who chanted in languages that predated human speech. He saw sacrificial victims, sometimes animals, sometimes people who had gotten too close to secrets that were meant to remain buried. "The Church survives," Father Benedetto explained in his impossibly calm voice, because it serves masters older and more powerful than the God it claims to worship. The Vatican is a fortress, Captain Weber, but not against the forces of evil. It is a fortress that contains those forces, channels them, uses them to maintain temporal power in a world that grows less faithful with each passing generation. Weber saw cardinals prostrating themselves before entities that writhed with too many limbs and spoke with voices like breaking stone. He saw popes, men he had sworn to protect with his life, offering prayers to gods whose names were written in books bound with human skin. This is why the Church has endured for 2 millennia, while empires rise and fall around it. This is why Vatican City remains sovereign in a world that has forgotten the meaning of divine right. This is why men like you pledged their lives to protect an institution whose true nature would drive them insane if they fully understood it. The images continued, showing Weber scenes from throughout church history. He saw the Crusades as they really were. Not holy wars to reclaim the birthplace of Christ, but massive ritual sacrifices designed to feed power to entities that grew strong on human suffering. He saw the Inquisition conducting interrogations that were actually summoning rituals, using torture and murder to thin the veil between dimensions. He saw the present day and understood that the pattern continued. Political scandals and financial irregularities were the least of the Vatican's secrets. The real business of the Church was conducted in chambers that appeared on no architectural plans, overseen by hierarchies that acknowledged no earthly authority. "Stop," Weber whispered, pressing his hands against his temples as if he could physically hold his sanity together. "Please, stop." "But we haven't reached the best part yet," Father Benedetto said, and now Weber could hear something distinctly predatory in the priest's voice. "We haven't discussed your role in all of this." "I don't have a role. I'm just a guard. I follow orders. Just following orders." How many atrocities have been justified with those words? But you're right, Captain Weber. You are just a guard. A faithful dog who sits and stays and kills on command, never questioning why or whom. New images flooded Weber's mind. Memories of his own actions viewed from a perspective that stripped away all the comfortable justifications he had built around them. He saw himself standing watch while screams echoed from behind closed doors. He saw himself escorting visitors whose eyes held no trace of human warmth, whose presence seemed to drain the life from plants and small animals. He saw himself disposing of evidence that would have exposed Vatican complicity in horrors spanning continents and centuries. You have been a very good dog, Captain Weber. Loyal and obedient and unquestioning. Which is why you're going to continue being a good dog even after our conversation ends. Weber found his voice enough to ask, "What do you mean?" "I mean that you're going to return to your duties tomorrow night as if nothing has happened. You're going to continue protecting the Holy Father and his advisors, knowing now what you're really protecting them from. You're going to stand guard during the night services, understanding finally what those services actually accomplish. And you're going to do all of this because the alternative is so much worse." "What alternative?" Father Benedetto leaned forward, and for the first time since the conversation began, Weber saw the priest's face clearly. What he saw there destroyed the last vestiges of his religious faith, and replaced them with a terror so pure it seemed to stop his heart. The thing that looked like Father Benedetto had the priest's features, but they were subtly wrong in ways that screamed of violation and corruption. The skin was too pale, the eyes too bright, and the mouth opened wider than human anatomy should have allowed. When it spoke, Weber could see that its teeth had been replaced with something that belonged in the mouth of a deep-sea predator. "The alternative, dear Captain, is that you join me in my current state of existence. Do you know what happens to Vatican guardians who develop inconvenient consciences? Do you know where the missing guards really go? The ones who are officially reported as having been transferred to other duties, or who simply vanish from the records entirely?" Weber didn't want to know, but the knowledge came anyway, flowing into his mind like poison poured into clear water. He saw a catacomb beneath the Vatican that was never mentioned in any tour, filled with the remains of Swiss guards who had asked the wrong questions or seen the wrong things. But they weren't simply dead. Death would have been a mercy. They had been transformed, their bodies and souls warped into shapes that served the Vatican's true masters as eternally vigilant sentinels. "We guard the deepest secrets," the thing that had been Father Benedetto explained. We ensure that no unauthorized person ever reaches the chambers where the real work is done. We hunt down anyone who tries to expose the truth, and we bring them back to face the consequences of their curiosity. Weber understood now why Father Benedetto was sitting in his confession booth, despite having died 3 days earlier. The priest had been transformed into something that was neither alive nor dead, but which retained enough of its original personality to be useful as a tool of the Vatican's security apparatus. You have a choice to make, Captain Weber. You can return to your duties with full knowledge of what you're really protecting, and live out the remainder of your natural life in the service of powers beyond your comprehension. Or you can try to act on what you've learned tonight, and discover what we do to guardians who forget their place. Weber found himself nodding, though he wasn't consciously aware of making the decision. The compulsion to agree, to submit, to return to the comfortable ignorance of following orders, was overwhelming. "I'll go back to my duties," he heard himself say. "I won't speak of this to anyone." Of course you won't, because you're a good dog. The thing that looked like Father Benedetto settled back into its original position, hands folded, head bowed, looking for all the world like a priest awaiting the arrival of penitents. Weber stumbled out of the confession booth on unsteady legs, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had learned. As he walked toward the basilica's exit, he heard Father Benedetto call after him in a voice that now sounded completely normal, completely human. "Captain Weber, give my regards to Cardinal Toretti when you see him tomorrow. Tell him that his brother is very much looking forward to their next conversation." Weber's blood turned to ice as he realized what the priest was implying. Cardinal Toretti was Father Benedetto's younger brother, and one of the Vatican's most influential power brokers. If the cardinal was involved in whatever conspiracy had claimed his brother's life and transformed him into this unholy guardian, then Weber's knowledge made him a target. But as he reached the basilica's doors, Weber discovered something even more terrifying than the threat to his own life. He discovered that he didn't care. The compulsion that the dead priest had placed on him was stronger than his fear, stronger than his moral outrage, stronger than his human instinct for self-preservation. He would return to his duties tomorrow night, and the night after that, and every night until he died or was transformed into something like Father Benedetto. He would stand guard over secrets that would drive lesser men insane. He would protect monsters who wore the faces of holy men. He would serve powers whose names couldn't be spoken in any human language. And he would do it all with the faithful obedience that had made him an ideal Swiss guard in the first place. Weber walked through the empty streets of Vatican City, past the Swiss Guard barracks where his brothers-in-arms slept peacefully, unaware that their captain had just learned the truth about what they were really protecting. Tomorrow night, he would stand at his post and watch for threats to Vatican security. He would be the perfect guardian, alert and unquestioning, and absolutely loyal. He would also be the perfect example of what the Vatican did to men who learned too much about its true nature. As Weber reached his quarters, he caught a glimpse of himself in a mirror by the door. For just a moment, he thought he saw something other than his own reflection looking back at him, something with 2 bright eyes and teeth that were just slightly too sharp. But when he looked again, he saw only Captain Hans Weber of the Swiss Guard, faithful protector of the Holy See. At least, that's what he would see from now on, even if it wasn't entirely true anymore. The call came through on Lieutenant Marco Santini's radio at 3:17 a.m., crackling with interference that made the dispatcher's voice sound distant and distorted. "Unit 7 to command. We have a situation in Sector 4. Request immediate backup and medical assistance." Santini, who was manning the night desk at Swiss Guard headquarters, immediately recognized the voice of Corporal Andreas Hoffmann, one of the most experienced guards in his unit. Hoffmann was not a man given to panic or uncertainty, which made the tremor in his voice deeply concerning. "Unit 7, this is command. Nature of situation." There was a long pause, filled with static and what sounded like wind, though the night was perfectly calm. When Hoffmann's voice came through again, it was barely above a whisper. "Command, I need you to see this for yourself. I can't. I don't know how to report what I'm seeing." Santini frowned at the radio. In 15 years of service, he had never heard Hoffmann sound so shaken. "Unit 7, give me your exact location." "South wall of the Vatican Museums, near the old archives entrance." Santini knew the location, a section of Vatican City that was technically within the Guard patrol route, but was rarely visited, especially at night. The old archives entrance had been sealed decades ago when the collections were moved to more modern facilities, and the area was little more than a maintenance corridor lined with storage rooms. Unit 7. Maintain position. I'm en route with backup. Santini grabbed his equipment and roused 2 other guards from the ready room. Within minutes, they were making their way through the dark streets of Vatican City towards Sector 4, their footsteps echoing off ancient stone walls. The walk to the museums took them past some of the Vatican's most sacred sites, the Sistine Chapel, where papal conclaves had been held for centuries, the Apostolic Palace, where the Pope's private chambers lay in darkness, and the gardens where generations of holy men had walked in contemplation. But tonight, those familiar landmarks seemed ominous rather than comforting, their shadows deeper and more threatening than usual. As they approached Sector 4, Santini noticed that the temperature seemed to be dropping with each step. His breath began to mist in the air, and the stone walls glistened with a thin layer of frost that definitely hadn't been there during his earlier patrol. They found Hoffman exactly where he had said he would be, standing motionless near the sealed archives entrance, his back pressed against the wall as if he were trying to put as much distance as possible between himself and something without actually fleeing his post. Hoffman was a big man, over 6 feet tall, and built like the mountain climber he had been before joining the Guard. But tonight he looked smaller somehow, diminished by whatever he had encountered. His face was pale in the beam of Santini's flashlight, and his hands were shaking despite his obvious efforts to control them. "Andreas," Santini called softly. "Report." Hoffman's eyes darted toward his lieutenant, then immediately returned to staring at something beyond the sealed archway. "Lieutenant, I've been standing here for 40 minutes, and I still don't believe what I'm seeing." Santini followed Hoffman's gaze and immediately understood why the corporal was having difficulty with his report. The entrance to the old archives had been sealed with a heavy steel door decades ago, welded shut and covered with official Vatican seals that warned against unauthorized entry. But tonight, the door was open. Not just unlocked, completely gone, as if it had never existed at all. Beyond the empty doorway, a corridor stretched into darkness that seemed to absorb the beam of Santini's flashlight. The walls were covered with symbols that definitely weren't part of standard Vatican architecture, twisted geometric patterns that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally, and images that suggested religious iconography from traditions much older than Christianity. But what made the sight truly impossible was the light that emerged from the depths of the corridor. It wasn't the steady illumination of electric fixtures or the warm glow of candles, but something that pulsed with an organic rhythm, like the heartbeat of some vast, buried creature. "How long has it been like this?" Santini asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Since about 2:30, Hoffman replied. "I was doing my regular patrol when I noticed the temperature drop. When I came to investigate, the door was just gone, and there were sounds coming from inside." "What kind of sounds?" Hoffman's face. The parchment felt heavier than it should have in Matteo Reiner's gloved hands. The ornate papal seal pressed into the cream-colored paper seemed to pulse with an otherworldly weight as he read his new assignment for the 3rd time. Night Watch, Apostolic Palace, Borgia Apartments. Alone. Matteo had served in the Swiss Guard for 6 years, long enough to know that certain assignments came with unspoken warnings. The way Captain Herzog's weathered face had tightened when handing over the orders. The subtle crossing of fellow guards when they heard where he'd be stationed. The maintenance worker, who'd simply shaken his head and muttered a prayer in Italian when Matteo mentioned his post. "It's just superstition," he told himself, adjusting the ceremonial halberd at his side. The Borgia Apartments had been closed to the public for decades, used now only for storage and the occasional historical research. What harm could come from watching over dusty artifacts and forgotten furniture? The sun was setting behind St. Peter's Basilica as Matteo made his way through the labyrinthine corridors of the Vatican. His footsteps echoed hollowly against the marble floors, each sound seeming to stretch into infinity before being swallowed by the oppressive silence. The further he ventured from the populated areas of the palace, the colder the air became, until his breath formed small clouds in the dim light of the ornate chandeliers. The heavy wooden door to the Borgia Apartments stood like a mouth frozen mid-scream, its dark oak surface carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the flickering candlelight. Mateo's key turned with surprising ease, the lock mechanism well-oiled despite the apartment's supposed disuse. The door swung open with barely a whisper. The first thing that struck him was the smell, not the mustiness he'd expected, but something else entirely. Something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in water, tinged with a metallic undertone that made his stomach turn. The apartment stretched before him in a series of interconnected rooms, each more opulent than the last, their frescoed ceilings lost in shadow. Mateo set up his post in the main reception hall, a chair positioned to give him a clear view of all entrances. The official instructions were simple: patrol every 2 hours, maintain a log of any disturbances, report any unauthorized presence immediately. What they hadn't mentioned was the portraits. The eyes followed him wherever he moved. It started with Pope Alexander VI himself, the infamous Rodrigo Borgia, whose portrait dominated the far wall. In the wavering candlelight, the painted eyes seemed to track Mateo's movements with an intelligence that made his skin crawl. But it wasn't just the Pope. Every face in every painting throughout the apartment seemed suddenly, impossibly aware of his presence. "Tricks of light," Mateo muttered, but his voice sounded thin and unconvincing in the vast space. He forced himself to focus on his logbook, recording the time of his first patrol, 21:00 hours. All quiet. By midnight, the quiet had become oppressive. The Vatican was never truly silent. There was always the distant hum of activity, the soft footfalls of late working clergy, the whisper of wind through ancient corridors. But here, in the Borgia apartments, silence pressed against his eardrums like a physical weight. It was during his second patrol that he first heard the whispers. At first, he dismissed them as wind through the old walls, or perhaps the settling of ancient wood. But as he moved through the bedchamber, the very room where Pope Alexander VI had died under mysterious circumstances, the whispers became unmistakably voices, multiple voices, speaking in a Latin so archaic that even his seminary-trained ear could barely parse the words. The voices seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, rising and falling in what sounded almost like a prayer, but wrong somehow. The rhythm was off, the intonation carrying undertones of something that made Mateo's Catholic upbringing recoil in instinctive horror. He stopped in the center of the room, hand tightening on his halberd. "Hello?" he called out, feeling foolish. "Is someone there?" The whispers stopped instantly, leaving a silence so complete it seemed to have physical weight. Then, slowly, a new sound began, a wet, sliding noise, like something being dragged across stone. It was coming from behind the massive tapestry that covered the eastern wall. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, to run back to the safety of the main palace and report. What? Voices? Sliding sounds? He'd be laughed out of the guard. His career ended by what could easily be explained as an overactive imagination working in an admittedly creepy environment. Instead, Mateo approached the tapestry. The sliding sound grew louder as he drew near, accompanied now by what sounded like labored breathing. With one quick motion, he yanked the heavy fabric aside. The wall behind was blank stone, unmarked except for dark stains that seemed to seep from the mortar itself. The sound stopped immediately, but the stains began to spread, forming patterns that looked disturbingly like letters in a script he didn't recognize. Mateo stumbled backward, his breathing shallow. The stains continued to expand until they covered most of the wall in what looked like a massive inscription. As he watched, transfixed with horror, the dark substance began to drip, pooling on the floor with a sound like rain on leaves. He turned and ran. "Captain Herzog, I need to speak with you." The sun was barely breaking the horizon as Mateo burst into his superior's office, still in his ceremonial uniform but with his hair disheveled and his face pale as communion wafer. Captain Herzog looked up from his morning prayers, taking in the younger man's appearance with knowing eyes. "The Borgia apartments," Herzog said. "It wasn't a question, sir. There was." Mateo struggled to find words that wouldn't sound like the ravings of a madman. "There were irregularities. Sounds, possible intruders." Herzog gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Sit down, Reiner. Tell me exactly what you experienced." For the next 20 minutes, Mateo recounted everything: the portraits that seemed to watch, the whispers in ancient Latin, the stains on the wall that formed into a legible script. He expected skepticism, perhaps concerns about his mental fitness for duty. What he didn't expect was the look of weary resignation that settled over Herzog's features. "You're the third guard this year," Herzog said quietly. "The first transferred to civilian duty. The second requested reassignment to the Swiss Army." Both gave similar reports. "Sir?" Herzog opened his desk drawer and withdrew a thick folder. "Official Vatican policy is that the Borgia apartments are maintained for historical preservation. Unofficially." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "There have been reports of disturbances for decades. Always during night watch. Always when guards are alone." Matteo's mouth went dry. "What kind of disturbances?" "The kind that don't make it into official reports." Herzog's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "The church has protocols for many things, Reiner. Exorcism, blessing, consecration. But some places," he shook his head, "some places resist holiness." The captain opened the folder and withdrew several documents. Even upside down, Matteo could see they were incident reports, each marked with the same location, Borgia Apartments. The stack was thicker than he'd expected. "The first recorded incident was in 1889, Herzog continued. "A guard reported seeing Pope Alexander VI walking the halls, but not as he appeared in paintings. The guard described him as changed, corrupted. The report was dismissed as hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. But it wasn't the last report, far from it. In 1923, a guard claimed the walls themselves were bleeding. In 1956, another reported that the furniture moved when he wasn't looking directly at it. In 1967, Herzog paused, his face troubled. In 1967, a guard was found catatonic at his post. He never spoke again, but he drew constantly, always the same image." Herzog slid a yellowed paper across the desk. The drawing was crude but unmistakably depicting the same wall Matteo had seen, covered in the same dark, dripping script. "What does the church say about all this?" Matteo asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Oh, officially? Nothing. The Vatican's position is that these are isolated incidents of psychological stress manifesting in similar ways due to the suggestive environment." Herzog's tone suggested his personal opinion differed significantly from the official line. "Unofficially, certain members of the Curia believe the Borgia family's activities left marks that go deeper than simple historical infamy." Matteo thought of the sweet, cloying smell in the apartments, the way the very air seemed thick with malevolent presence. Activities? Rodrigo Borgia was many things, Reiner, but a holy man was not among them. The stories of his papacy, murder, incest, blasphemy, rituals that would make a demon weep with joy. Some sins stain more than the soul. Some leave echoes in the very stones. The captain closed the folder with a decisive snap. "You have two choices. I can transfer you to day duty at St. Peter's Square crowds, tourists, normal problems. Or you can return tonight. With backup this time. There are researchers who would be very interested in a first-hand account from someone who witnessed the phenomena and retained their sanity." Matteo stared at his superior, processing the implications. "Researchers? What kind of researchers?" Herzog's smile was grim. "The kind who don't officially exist." Father Marcus Delacroix didn't look like an exorcist. Slight of build, with thinning gray hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, he could have been mistaken for a librarian or perhaps a university professor. Only his eyes betrayed the steel beneath his mild exterior pale blue orbs that seemed to see far more than they revealed. "Matteo, isn't it?" His English carried a faint French accent. "Captain Herzog has told me about your experience. Most illuminating." They stood outside the Borgia apartments as the sun set for the second time. This time, Matteo wasn't alone. Beside Father Delacroix stood Dr. Sarah Chen, introduced simply as a consultant in historical anomalies. Her equipment bag looked decidedly non-historical, bristling with electronic devices Matteo didn't recognize. "Before we enter," Father Delacroix continued, "I want you to understand what we believe we're dealing with. The Borgia family, particularly under Rodrigo's papacy, engaged in practices that were antithetical to Christian doctrine. There are documented accounts of black masses, human sacrifice, and the deliberate corruption of sacred spaces. Dr. Chen adjusted one of her instruments. From a scientific perspective, we're investigating reports of environmental anomalies that correlate with specific historical events. Energy signatures, temperature fluctuations, electromagnetic disturbances. The church calls it spiritual contamination. I call it data. And if the data suggests something genuinely supernatural, Matteo asked, then we document it, she replied matter-of-factly. And Father Delacroix earns his paycheck. The priest's smile was wan. The church learned long ago that some problems require both faith and method. We are prepared for either eventuality. Matteo's key turned in the lock with the same eerie ease as the night before. The door swung open to reveal the reception hall, exactly as he'd left it chair positioned for optimal surveillance, logbook open to his final entry. But the smell was stronger now. The sweet corruption so thick it seemed to coat their throats with every breath. Dr. Chen immediately began setting up her equipment, placing sensors at strategic points throughout the room. The devices hummed softly, their LED displays showing readings that made her frown. Electromagnetic activity is off the charts, she murmured, adjusting dials. Temperature differential of nearly 10 degrees between different areas of the room. And the air composition. She looked up, her expression troubled. There are trace elements here that shouldn't exist at this altitude, or frankly, anywhere on Earth. Father Delacroix was examining the portraits, his pale eyes studying each painted face with professional interest. The Vatican commissioned most of these during the late Renaissance, he explained. But several are much older. This one here. He pointed to a small portrait tucked in a shadowed alcove. This predates Rodrigo's papacy by at least a century. It shouldn't be here. Matteo looked more closely at the painting. The figure depicted was gaunt and pale, with eyes that seemed to hold depths no human gaze should possess. Unlike the other portraits, this one seemed to actively drain light from its surroundings, creating a pool of shadow that hurt to look at directly. Who is it? Matteo asked. I'm not certain, but the style suggests it may be connected to the Cathars, a heretical sect that was supposedly eliminated in the 13th century. If it is what I think it is. Father Delacroix's voice trailed off as Dr. Chen's equipment began beeping urgently. We're getting massive spikes across all sensors, she reported. Whatever's about to happen, it's building towards something big. As if summoned by her words, the whispers began again. But this time, there were more of them, dozens of voices speaking in overlapping Latin that seemed to come from every direction at once. The temperature plummeted, their breath forming clouds as frost began to spread across the ancient frescoes. Sanct Michael Archangel, Father Delacroix began, his voice cutting through the supernatural chorus. Defende nos in proelio. The whispers rose to a crescendo, drowning out the prayer. The very air seemed to thicken, pressing against them with malevolent intent. Dr. Chen's equipment was going haywire, displays flickering between impossible readings before going dark entirely. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The silence was absolute. Even the distant sounds of Vatican life that had provided a comforting backdrop the night before were gone. They stood in a pocket of perfect stillness that felt as unnatural as the chaos that had preceded it. That wasn't random, Dr. Chen whispered, checking her instruments. The pattern was too organized. It was responding to something. Father Delacroix had gone very pale. Or someone. A new sound reached them, footsteps, slow and measured, coming from the bedchamber. But these weren't the hurried steps of a living person. Each footfall seemed to echo with the weight of centuries, accompanied by a rustling sound like silk being dragged across stone. Stay together, Father Delacroix commanded, pulling a crucifix from beneath his robes. Whatever we encounter, remember that it feeds on fear and isolation. They moved toward the bedchamber in a tight group, Matteo's halberd at the ready, Dr. Chen clutching a handheld scanner that flickered with residual energy. The sweet smell of corruption grew stronger with each step, now overlaid with something else, the unmistakable scent of burning flesh. The bedchamber door stood open, revealing the same opulent space where Pope Alexander VI had died. But now the room was occupied. The figure standing beside the massive four-poster bed wore the papal robes of office, but they hung from a frame that was no longer entirely human. What had once been Pope Alexander VI or something wearing his form turned to face them with a smile that split his face in ways anatomy shouldn't allow. "Welcome," it said in a voice like grinding stone, "to my eternal Vatican." The thing that had been Pope Alexander VI moved with fluid grace that defied the decay visible in its features. Where flesh should have been firm, it sagged and shifted, as if barely maintaining cohesion. Where eyes should have held the spark of life, there was only an hungry darkness that seemed to pull light from the room. "You are trespassing," it continued, its voice carrying harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce. "These are my chambers, my domain, my eternal seat of power." Father Delacroix stepped forward, crucifix raised. "Rodrigo Borgia died in 1503. You are not him. You are something that wears his memory like a stolen coat." The entity laughed, the sound like breaking glass mixed with distant screams. "Death? Death was merely a transition. I made certain arrangements during my time on the papal throne. Contracts written in blood and sealed with soul fire. I did not die, priest. I evolved." Dr. Chen's scanner was registering readings that should have been impossible. "The electromagnetic signature is unlike anything in the literature," she whispered. "It's as if reality itself is being rewritten around it." "Reality," the Borgia thing mused, "is far more malleable than your science suggests. Faith can move mountains, but corruption can reshape the very foundations of existence. I learned this from teachers far older and more knowledgeable than any saint." It gestured to the walls around them, and Matteo saw that the dark stains had returned, spreading across every surface in patterns that hurt to perceive directly. But now, he could read them not with his eyes, but with some deeper part of his mind that recoiled in horror at the understanding. They weren't stains, they were names. Thousands upon thousands of names, written in substances that predated human language. The names of every soul that had been consumed, corrupted, or claimed by whatever dwelt in these cursed chambers. "The Vatican believes it sits upon the foundation of St. Peter's martyrdom," the entity continued conversationally. "But foundations can be undermined, corrupted from within. Every black mass I celebrated, every innocent sacrificed, every blasphemy committed in the name of power, all of it fed the cancer growing in the very heart of Christianity." Father Delacroix began to pray in earnest now, his Latin clear and strong despite the terror etched on his features. But the entity only smiled wider, its jaw unhinging in ways that revealed teeth like broken obsidian. "Your prayers have no power here, priest. This ground was consecrated to older gods, darker purposes. Your Christ's light cannot penetrate shadows that have been fed for centuries." The air in the chamber began to shimmer, reality bending around the Borgia thing, like heat waves rising from sun-baked stone. Through the distortion, other figures became visible, papal regalia, worn by forms that had never been human, advisors with faces that shifted between human and something far worse, courtiers whose flesh moved independently of their bones. "Behold my true court," the entity proclaimed. "The faithful who chose damnation over salvation, corruption over purity. We have waited so long for the final phase to begin." "Final phase?" Matteo heard himself ask, though every instinct screamed at him to flee. "The complete inversion of this sacred space. When enough corruption has seeped into the stones, when enough darkness has been fed by faithful souls led astray, then the transformation will be complete. The Vatican will become what it always had the potential to be, not a beacon of light, but a font of beautiful, eternal darkness." Dr. Chen's equipment was sparking now, overloaded by energies that her instruments couldn't process. "The readings are beyond any scale," she gasped. "Whatever this is, it's affecting reality at a quantum level." "Science and faith," the entity mused. "Two sides of the same coin, both blind to the greater truths. But you will see soon enough. All of you will see." The false papal court began to move closer, their forms becoming more solid with each step. Matteo could see now that they weren't ghosts or spirits, they were something far worse. They were possibilities made manifest, the potential for corruption that existed within every human soul given form and substance. Father Delacroix's prayers grew more desperate, sweat beading on his forehead as he fought against the oppressive spiritual weight pressing down on them. The crucifix in his hands began to smoke, the metal growing hot, as if the very symbols of faith were being rejected by the atmosphere itself. "Run," he whispered to his companions. "This is beyond any of us. We need to evacuate the entire Vatican and call for a full ecclesiastical response." But when they turned toward the door, they found their exit blocked by another figure, this one wearing the robes of a Swiss guard, but clearly one of their own number who had been claimed by whatever force dwelt in these chambers. "The only escape," the Borgia thing said pleasantly, "is to join us, to accept the corruption freely and willingly. Fighting only prolongs the inevitable and increases the pain." The possessed guard drew his sword, the blade now black with the same substance that covered the walls. Behind him, more figures were emerging from shadows that shouldn't have been deep enough to hide them. Other guards, clergy members, even what looked like tourists who had somehow wandered into this nightmare. "How many?" Dr. Chen asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Hundreds over the decades," came the reply. "Every soul that has encountered us and lacked the spiritual strength to resist, they become part of the greater work, willing or not." Matteo gripped his halberd tighter, knowing it would be useless against foes that had already died once. Around them, the walls began to pulse like a living heart, the dark inscriptions writhing as if trying to free themselves from the stone. The trap was closing, and they were running out of options. Father Delacroix made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone who hadn't witnessed what they'd seen. Instead of continuing his defensive prayers, he began to speak in a language that predated Latin, words that seemed to come from the very foundations of human faith. The effect was immediate and violent. The Borgia entity shrieked, its form wavering like smoke in a strong wind. The possessed guards stumbled backward, their black weapons clattering to the floor as they clutched at their heads. "Hebrew," Dr. Chen realized. "He's speaking ancient Hebrew. Not just any Hebrew," Father Delacroix said through gritted teeth, sweat pouring down his face. "The most sacred prayers, the ones that call upon the name itself. It's causing them pain, but I can't maintain this for long." The entity was already recovering, its form solidifying as it adapted to the spiritual assault. "Clever, priest. But even the oldest words lose their power when spoken in a place that has been thoroughly corrupted. You cannot purify what has been willingly defiled." To prove its point, the thing raised one skeletal hand and spoke a single word in a language that made Matteo's bones ache to hear. Immediately, the Hebrew prayers faltered on Father Delacroix's lips, replaced by choking sounds as something invisible wrapped around his throat. "The fundamental flaw in your theology," the entity continued as the priest struggled for air, "is the assumption that good is stronger than evil. But evil is so much more creative. It finds ways to turn strength into weakness, faith into despair, hope into horror." Dr. Chen was frantically working with her damaged equipment, trying to restore functionality to anything that might help their situation. Sparks flew from her scanner as she forced connections that were never meant to carry the kind of energy that saturated the room. "There's a pattern to the electromagnetic disturbances," she said rapidly. "It's like a frequency, a specific wavelength that maintains the manifestation. If I can generate a counter-frequency—" "Your science is quaint," the Borgia thing said, turning its attention to her, "but you fundamentally misunderstand what you're dealing with. This isn't electromagnetic energy, it's spiritual corruption made manifest. Your instruments can detect it, but they cannot affect it." To demonstrate, it gestured toward her equipment. Every device sparked and died simultaneously, their screens going dark as acrid smoke began to rise from their casings. "Now," the entity said with satisfaction. "Where were we? Ah yes, the expansion of our domain." The walls of the chamber began to crack, not physically but spiritually. Through the growing fissures, Matteo could see glimpses of other spaces, corridors he recognized as being deep within the Vatican, but transformed into something hellish. Statues of saints had been replaced by grotesque idols. Holy water fonts ran with blood, and the very air shimmered with malevolent energy. "You see," the thing continued, "the corruption spreads. Every night, every moment of despair or doubt or sin within these walls feeds the transformation. Soon, the entire Vatican will exist in both realities simultaneously, a holy site to the faithful, a temple of darkness to those who see truly." Father Delacroix managed to break free of whatever was choking him, gasping out desperate prayers in a mixture of languages. But his efforts seemed only to amuse the entity. "Your faith is admirable but misplaced, priest. You pray to a God who allows such corruption to exist in his most sacred spaces. What does that tell you about either his power or his interest in human welfare?" It was then that Matteo noticed something the entity had overlooked in its gloating, a small detail that might mean nothing, or might mean everything. Among all the corrupted symbols and blasphemous imagery that now covered the walls, there was one spot that remained clean. Just above the doorframe, barely visible in the shifting light, was a small carving of Saint Michael the Archangel that showed no sign of the spreading corruption. Without thinking, he pointed his halberd at the carving and spoke the first prayer that came to mind, not in Latin or Hebrew, but in his native German, the simple words his grandmother had taught him as a child. The effect was like striking a match in a powder keg. Light erupted from the small carving. Not the warm golden glow of candlelight, but something far more intense. The clean, piercing radiance of absolute truth. The Borgia entity screamed, its form beginning to dissolve under the assault of purifying light. "Impossible!" it shrieked. "This ground is ours. The corruption is complete." "Not complete," Father Delacroix said, understanding dawning on his face. "There's always something held back. Always some small piece that remembers what it was meant to be." He joined his voice to Matteo's prayer. Then, Dr. Chen added her own, not a prayer exactly, but a statement of scientific principle that amounted to the same thing. A assertion that truth existed independently of perception, that reality had laws, that corruption could bend, but not break. The light spread from the carving, following the clean lines of original sacred geometry that had been obscured, but not destroyed by centuries of blasphemy. Like water finding its natural course, the purifying radiance flowed along hidden channels carved into the very foundations of the building. The possessed figures around them began to scream, their forms becoming translucent as the light passed through them. They weren't destroyed, Matteo could see that, but they were being forced back into whatever realm they had emerged from, the boundary between realities reasserting itself. "This is not over," the Borgia entity raged as its form began to fade. "The corruption runs too deep. We will return, perhaps," Father Delacroix said calmly, still maintaining his prayers. "But not today, and not unopposed." The last thing they saw before the supernatural manifestations faded entirely was the entity's eyes, burning with hatred and promise of future vengeance. Then the light faded to normal levels, leaving them standing in a chamber that looked exactly as it had when they'd first entered, dusty, abandoned, but no longer actively malevolent. Dr. Chen slumped against the wall, exhausted. "My equipment is completely fried. I'll never be able to prove what happened here." "Proof isn't always necessary," Father Delacroix replied, examining the small carving that had somehow remained clean through centuries of corruption. "Sometimes faith is enough." Matteo looked around the chamber one last time before they left. The portraits still watched from their frames, but their gaze seemed somehow less malevolent now, more resigned than actively threatening. The sweet smell of corruption was fading, replaced by the normal mustiness of old buildings and forgotten spaces. As they locked the door behind them, Captain Herzog was waiting in the corridor, his expression carefully neutral. "Report?" he asked simply. "The situation has been addressed," Father Delacroix replied. "Though I recommend the apartments remain sealed indefinitely. Some victories are temporary." Herzog nodded, as if this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. "And the guard rotation?" "Can resume normal schedules, though perhaps not alone, and preferably with personnel who have strong personal faith." As they walked back toward the main palace, Matteo couldn't shake the feeling that they'd won a battle rather than a war. Somewhere in the depths of the Vatican, ancient evils still stirred, held back by faith and vigilance but never truly defeated. Behind them, the Borgia apartments settled back into their watchful silence, keeping their secrets for another day. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, bearing the unmistakable seal of Vatican City. Guard Captain Alessandro Bianchi held it with reverence, though something about the heavy parchment made his fingers tremble. After 15 years of faithful service to the Swiss Guard, he had seen many assignments, but none had ever arrived with such ceremony or such secrecy. Captain Bianchi. The letter began in formal Latin. You are hereby summoned for a special assignment of the utmost confidentiality. Report to Cardinal Toretti's private chambers at midnight, on the Ides of March. Come alone. Tell no one of this correspondence. Ad majorem Dei gloriam. Alessandro folded the letter carefully, his mind racing. Cardinal Toretti had been a fixture in Vatican politics for over 3 decades, a man whose influence extended far beyond the walls of St. Peter's. But he was also known for his involvement in the Church's most closely guarded secrets, the kind of secrets that required Swiss Guard protection not from earthly threats, but from something far more sinister. That evening, Alessandro donned his dress uniform with unusual care. The blue and yellow stripes seemed to shimmer in the lamplight of his small apartment overlooking the Vatican walls. He checked his ceremonial sword, a blade that had been blessed by 3 different popes, and was said to have been forged from metal taken from the original chains of St. Peter himself. Tonight, something told him he might need more than ceremonial protection. The corridors of the Apostolic Palace were eerily quiet as Alessandro made his way to Cardinal Toretti's chambers. His footsteps echoed off the marble floors, each sound seeming to multiply in the darkness. The usual tourists and clergy were long gone, leaving only the night staff and the ever-present Swiss guards at their posts. But even they seemed fewer tonight, as if the Vatican itself was holding its breath. Cardinal Toretti's door was ancient oak, carved with scenes from the martyrdom of various saints. Alessandro knocked 3 times, as was protocol. Enter, Captain, came a voice from within, though it sounded strangely hollow. The cardinal's chambers were dimly lit by candles, casting dancing shadows across walls lined with leather-bound volumes and religious artifacts. Cardinal Toretti sat behind an enormous desk, his gaunt frame hunched over a collection of documents. He looked up as Alessandro entered, and the guard captain was startled to see how much the cardinal had aged since their last meeting. His face was drawn, his eyes sunken, and there was a tremor in his hands that hadn't been there before. Captain Bianchi, the cardinal said, his voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for coming. Please, sit. Alessandro took the offered chair, noting that the cardinal's office felt unusually cold despite the season. I have a task for you, Cardinal Toretti continued. One that will test not only your courage, but your faith. Are you prepared to serve the Church in ways that may challenge everything you believe you know about this holy place? I am, Your Eminence, Alessandro replied, without hesitation, though something deep in his chest tightened with unease. The cardinal slid a leather portfolio across the desk. Inside, you will find the details of your assignment. You are to guard a particular location within the Vatican, a place that few know exists and fewer still have seen. It is called the Sanctum Umbra, the Shadow Sanctuary. Alessandro opened the portfolio with steady hands, though his heart was racing. Inside were architectural drawings of tunnels and chambers he had never seen in his years of service. Despite knowing every public and semi-public space in Vatican City, these tunnels run beneath St. Peter's Basilica, the cardinal explained. They predate the current structure by centuries, perhaps millennia. They were here when the first Christians came to bury their dead, and they have served various purposes throughout the Church's history. What am I to guard, Your Eminence? Cardinal Toretti was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he looked up, his eyes held a sadness that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. Something that should have remained buried, Captain. Something that our predecessors thought they could contain, control, perhaps even redeem. They were wrong. 3 days later, Alessandro stood before a hidden entrance behind the high altar of St. Peter's Basilica. The entrance was concealed behind what appeared to be a solid marble relief of the Archangel Michael casting Satan into hell. When Cardinal Toretti pressed a specific sequence of the relief's details, the marble shifted silently aside, revealing a narrow stone staircase that descended into absolute darkness. From this point forward, Captain, you must never speak of what you see or experience, the cardinal said, handing Alessandro an ornate lantern that seemed to emit more shadow than light. The Church's survival may depend on your discretion. Alessandro nodded and began his descent. The stairs were worn smooth by countless footsteps over the centuries. The walls were lined with faded frescoes depicting scenes that Alessandro couldn't quite make out in the dim light figures that seemed to writhe and shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. The air grew colder with each step, and he could feel the immense weight of St. Peter's Basilica above him. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, Alessandro reached the bottom of the stairs. Before him stretched a corridor carved from the living rock beneath Rome. Unlike the ornate passages above, these tunnels were primitive, ancient, predating the glory of the Vatican by centuries. His footsteps echoed strangely here, sometimes seeming to come from behind him rather than beneath his feet. The lantern's light seemed to struggle against the darkness, creating a small bubble of illumination that barely extended beyond his reach. Following the map Cardinal Torretti had provided, Alessandro navigated a maze of tunnels. He passed alcoves filled with bones arranged in intricate patterns, their empty sockets seeming to track his movement. Some of the skulls bore symbols he didn't recognize, definitely not Christian, possibly not even Roman. As he walked deeper into the labyrinth, Alessandro began to hear something, a low humming that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It wasn't quite music, but it had a rhythm, a purpose. It made his teeth ache and caused the flame in his lantern to flicker erratically. Finally, after nearly an hour of navigation, Alessandro reached his destination, a massive circular chamber carved from black stone. The ceiling disappeared into shadows above, and the walls were lined with niches containing artifacts that hurt to look at directly. At the center of the chamber stood a structure that defied easy description, part altar, part sarcophagus, part prison. It was made of the same black stone as the chamber walls, but it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Strange symbols covered every surface, carved so deeply they might have been burned into the rock. Chains of an unusual silver metal were wrapped around the entire structure, and they hummed with the same frequency as the walls. And sitting in a simple wooden chair before this ominous structure was another Swiss guard. Alessandro's heart leaped. The man wore the traditional uniform, but something was wrong. His posture was too rigid, too still. As Alessandro approached, he could see that the guard's eyes were open but completely white, as if the pupils had simply vanished. "Guard Muller?" Alessandro whispered, recognizing the man from the roster. Heinrich Muller had been reported missing from duty 6 months ago, presumably having abandoned his post, a scandal that had been quickly covered up. Muller's head turned toward Alessandro, with a motion that was too smooth, too controlled. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that shouldn't have been possible from a human throat. "Captain Bianchi," Muller said, though his lips barely moved. "Welcome to your vigil." "Heinrich, what happened to you?" Muller's face showed no recognition, no emotion. "I am the guardian of the threshold, as were those before me, as you shall be after me." Alessandro drew his sword instinctively, though he wasn't sure what he could fight here. "Cardinal Torretti sent me to relieve you. You can return to your duties above." A sound came from Muller, then it might have been laughter, but it held no warmth, no humanity. "There is no relief from this duty, Captain. There is only the watching and the waiting and the prevention of what must never be allowed to wake." As if summoned by Muller's words, the black structure at the center of the chamber began to pulse with a faint, sickly light. The chains tightened with a sound like breaking bones, and something inside the structure shifted. "What is that?" Alessandro demanded. "The first," Muller replied, his white eyes never blinking. "The one who came before salvation, before redemption, before hope. The church found it here when they built the first basilica. They thought they could contain it, use it, perhaps even convert it. But some things are older than God's love, Captain. Some things remember when the world was young and terrible." The humming grew louder, and Alessandro could feel it in his bones now, a vibration that seemed to be coming from inside his own body. The symbols on the walls began to glow with the same sickly light as the central structure. "How long have you been here?" Alessandro asked. "Time moves differently in the Sanctum Umbra," Muller replied. "Has it been months? Years? Centuries? I remember being young once, but that might have been someone else's memory." Alessandro looked around the chamber again, noting details he had missed before. In some of the wall niches, he could see other figures, Swiss guards in uniforms from different eras, all sitting in similar positions to Muller, all with the same white, empty eyes. "How many?" he whispered. "One for each generation," Muller said. "Each serves until he becomes part of the watching, part of the binding. The church tells the world we protect the Pope, and we do. But first, we protect the world from this. Alessandro spent his first night in the Sanctum Umbra, trying to understand what he was supposed to do. Mueller had provided no instruction beyond cryptic references to watching and preventing. But as the hours passed, Alessandro began to understand through experience what his duty entailed. The thing in the black structure, he refused to think of it as anything more specific, was constantly testing its bonds. The chains would tighten and loosen in rhythm with its movements. And occasionally, the entire structure would pulse with energy that made Alessandro's vision blur and his mind fill with images that couldn't possibly be memories. He saw civilizations that had never existed, at least not in any history he knew. He saw creatures that violated every natural law, beings that existed in dimensions that human minds weren't designed to comprehend. And through it all, he felt a consciousness pressing against his own, ancient beyond measure, and malevolent beyond description. "It's trying to get inside your head," Mueller warned during one of Alessandro's more severe episodes. "The first night is always the worst. After that, you learn to build walls." "How do I fight it?" Alessandro asked, gripping his blessed sword until his knuckles went white. "You don't fight it," Mueller replied. "You endure it. You let it exhaust itself against your faith, your duty, your humanity. Eventually, it will withdraw and wait for another opportunity. But it never stops trying." As if to emphasize the point, the chamber suddenly filled with whispers in languages Alessandro didn't recognize. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, overlapping until they became a cacophony of malice. The lantern flame turned from warm yellow to cold blue, and the shadows began to move independently of any light source. Alessandro closed his eyes and began to pray, not in Latin or Italian, but in the simple words his grandmother had taught him as a child. Somehow, the innocent faith of those childhood prayers seemed to carry more power here than all the formal liturgy he had learned in his years of service. Gradually, the whispers faded, and the shadows returned to their proper places. "Well done," Mueller said, and for the first time, there was something almost human in his voice. "You're stronger than most. That will serve you well in the days to come." "How long before I become like you?" Mueller was quiet for so long that Alessandro thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words carried infinite sadness. "The process is different for everyone. Some resist for months, others for years. A few have lasted decades. But eventually, the sanctum claims us all. The watching never ends, Captain. The vigil is eternal." On his 7th day in the Sanctum Umbra, Alessandro made a discovery that changed everything he thought he knew about his assignment. While exploring the outer chambers during one of the entity's dormant periods, he found a hidden alcove containing records that dated back to the founding of the Vatican itself. The documents were written in multiple languages: Latin, Greek, Aramaic, and others he couldn't identify. But what he could translate painted a horrifying picture of the Church's early history. According to these records, the entity in the black structure wasn't just something the Church had found. It was something they had deliberately sought out. Early Christian leaders, desperate to compete with the mystery cults and pagan religions of the Roman Empire, had made contact with forces they didn't understand in hopes of gaining supernatural power for their fledgling faith. What they found beneath the hill where St. Peter was supposedly buried was indeed powerful, but it was also utterly inimical to everything Christianity claimed to represent. The entity, the documents, referred to it only as the first apostle, offered knowledge and power, but at a price that would have destroyed the Church from within. Realizing their mistake, the early Church Fathers had attempted to banish the entity, but it was too deeply rooted in the location to be removed entirely. Instead, they built their basilica over it, creating an elaborate prison disguised as a place of worship. The Swiss Guard tradition of protecting the Pope was real, but it was secondary to their true purpose, maintaining the eternal vigil over this cosmic horror. "You found the archive," Mueller said when Alessandro returned to the central chamber. "Most don't discover it until their 2nd or 3rd week." "Why didn't Cardinal Toretti tell me the truth?" Alessandro demanded. "Because the truth would have broken you before you ever set foot in here," Mueller replied. "The Church has learned over the centuries that it's better to let new guardians discover the reality gradually. Those who learn everything at once rarely last more than a few days before they either flee or go mad." Alessandro stared at the black structure, watching the chains pulse with containment energy. How many people know? Above ground? Perhaps a dozen at any given time. The Pope, obviously. A few cardinals. The head of the Swiss Guard, though he may not know all the details. The knowledge is carefully compartmentalized, passed down through specific bloodlines and sacred oaths. And down here? Everyone knows eventually. The entity makes sure of that. It wants us to understand the futility of our task, the inevitable failure of our faith. It feeds on despair as much as on the life force it draws from its guardians. As if summoned by their conversation, the structure began to pulse more rapidly. The chains grew taut, and a sound emerged that was almost like speech, almost like a voice speaking backwards through water. "It's trying to communicate," Alessandro said, moving closer despite every instinct telling him to run. "Don't listen," Mueller warned urgently. "That's how it got to me. I thought I could understand it, reason with it, perhaps even convert it. The entity's intelligence is vast, but it's also completely alien. Human concepts of morality, redemption, and love are not just foreign to it, they're actively painful. It experiences our faith as a form of torture, which is why it's so determined to corrupt us." But Alessandro was already listening, drawn by a curiosity that he recognized as both scholarly and spiritual. The backward speech began to resolve into words, then into concepts, then into visions that flooded his mind with impossible knowledge. He saw the birth of the universe from a perspective that predated light itself. He witnessed the formation of stars and planets through the eyes of something that existed in the spaces between atoms. He experienced the first stirrings of life on Earth, but also the presence of other forms of existence that had arrived from distances that couldn't be measured in any human understanding of space or time. And through it all, he felt the entity's desperate hunger, not for food or energy in any conventional sense, but for the simple, terrible need to not be alone in a cosmos that had moved beyond its understanding. "It's not evil," Alessandro gasped, pulling himself back from the brink of total mental absorption. "It's lost. Evil, lost the distinction, is meaningless," Mueller said. "What matters is that its very existence is antithetical to human reality. If it were ever to escape, to reassert its presence in our world, the results would be catastrophic beyond imagination. Not because it wants to destroy us, but because its mere presence would unravel the fundamental forces that allow our universe to function." Alessandro looked at his fellow guard with new understanding. "That's why you stayed. Not out of duty, but out of compassion. Compassion for humanity, yes, but also..." Mueller paused, his white eyes flickering with something that might have been the ghost of human emotion. "Also, compassion for it. The entity has been imprisoned here for nearly 2,000 years, Captain. It dreams of home, of others of its kind, of a universe that no longer exists. In its way, it suffers as much as any creature ever has." Vatican City, 1981. Guard Captain Heinrich Müller had served the Holy See for 12 years, but nothing in his training had prepared him for what lurked in the ancient corridors beneath St. Peter's Basilica. The Swiss Guard's reputation was built on unwavering loyalty and absolute discretion, qualities that would be tested beyond human limits during the autumn of 1981. It began with whispers among the night watch. Guards spoke of footsteps echoing through empty halls, the metallic scrape of halberds against stone where no living soul walked. Heinrich dismissed these reports as the product of exhausted minds and overactive imaginations. The Vatican was old, its walls thick with history and shadow. Strange sounds were to be expected. But when guard Stefan Bachmann failed to report for his dawn patrol, Heinrich's skepticism crumbled. Stefan was found 3 levels beneath the Apostolic Palace, in a corridor that hadn't been used since the Renaissance. His body lay perfectly still, his ceremonial uniform untouched, but his face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. More disturbing was the position of his halberd driven deep into the ancient stone wall with inhuman force, as if wielded by something far stronger than mortal hands. The Vatican's physician ruled it a heart attack brought on by extreme fear, but Heinrich noticed what others missed. The scratches in the stone around Stefan's halberd, forming symbols that predated Christianity itself. 3 nights later, Heinrich stood vigil in the same corridor. The Vatican had forbidden further investigation, but a Swiss guard's duty transcended bureaucratic orders. As midnight approached, the temperature plummeted. His breath came in visible puffs as shadows seemed to writhe along the walls. That's when he heard it, the measured footsteps of a guard on patrol, accompanied by the distinctive tap of a halberd against stone. But Heinrich was alone. The sounds grew closer, echoing from the darkness ahead. Heinrich raised his own weapon, his training overriding terror, as a figure materialized from the gloom. It wore the uniform of the Swiss Guard, but wrong the colors too deep, the fabric seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. The face beneath the beret was Stefan's, but changed. His eyes had become black voids, and when he opened his mouth, no words emerged, only the sound of metal grinding against metal. "Stefan," Heinrich whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the narrow space. "What happened to you?" The phantom Stefan raised his halberd, and Heinrich saw that the weapon's blade dripped with something darker than blood. As their eyes met, Heinrich felt something probing his mind, cold fingers of consciousness that didn't belong to anything human. In that moment, he understood. Stefan hadn't died of fear. He had been claimed by something that had waited centuries for the perfect vessel. The phantom stepped forward, and Heinrich saw other figures emerging from the shadows behind him. Guards from different eras, their uniforms spanning centuries of service, all bearing the same empty eyes. An army of the damned, collected by something that fed on loyalty and twisted it into eternal servitude. Heinrich's training took over. He struck first, his halberd meeting Stefan's with a sound like thunder. But his weapon passed through the phantom as if through smoke, while Stefan's blade left a very real gash across Heinrich's chest. The other phantom guards advanced, their weapons raised, their movements perfectly synchronized. Fighting the impossible, Heinrich retreated deeper into the corridors. Behind him, he heard the sound of pursuit, not running footsteps, but the measured march of an undead patrol. The Vatican's ancient stones seemed to pulse around him, as if the building itself was alive and complicit in his torment. He emerged into a circular chamber he'd never seen before, its walls covered in frescoes that hurt to look at directly. In the center stood an altar carved from black stone, and upon it lay a halberd unlike any in the guard's arsenal. Its blade was inscribed with symbols that seemed to move in his peripheral vision, and its shaft was made from what looked like polished bone. As the phantom guards filled the chamber's entrance, Heinrich understood. This was the source, some relic from before the Vatican's founding, something that had corrupted the sacred ground from within. The building's holiness was a facade, built over something far older and infinitely more malevolent. The phantom Stefan spoke then, his voice a chorus of the damned. "Join us, Captain. Guard this place for eternity. Serve as we serve." Heinrich looked at the cursed halberd on the altar, then at his own weapon. He had two choices: surrender to whatever force had claimed his men, or destroy himself before it could take him. But as he raised his halberd to his own throat, he felt the cold touch of phantom hands restraining him. "Death is not escape," Stefan's voice echoed. "There is only service, only duty, only the guard." The last thing Heinrich remembered was the feeling of his own will dissolving, replaced by something ancient and hungry. When Vatican security found him the next morning, he was standing perfectly at attention in the center of the chamber. His eyes had gone black, and when they tried to speak to him, he responded only with the measured steps of a guard on eternal patrol. The Vatican sealed the lower levels permanently after that night. Official records state that Captain Müller suffered a nervous breakdown and was quietly retired to a monastery in Switzerland. But the night guards know better. They've heard the sound of his boots echoing through walls, the tap of his halberd keeping time with footsteps that have no end. And sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, they see him standing at the end of distant corridors, perfectly uniformed, perfectly still, waiting for new recruits to join his phantom regiment in guarding secrets that should never see the light of day. Vatican City, 1994. The Vatican's most protected secret wasn't housed in its archives or hidden beneath its ancient stones. It walked among the living, wearing the face of Cardinal Alessandro Torretti. For 40 years, he had served as confessor to the Swiss Guard, the one man trusted with their deepest fears and darkest sins. But Guard Lieutenant Marco Rossetti was beginning to suspect that something far more sinister than absolution took place behind the confessor's closed doors. It started when his friend Paolo failed to return from confession. Paolo Vento had been scheduled for his monthly spiritual meeting with Cardinal Toretti at 3 a.m. an odd hour. But the cardinal claimed it was when he could focus most clearly on God's voice. Paolo had entered the small chapel in the Apostolic Palace, carrying the weight of a terrible secret. During his patrol the previous week, he had glimpsed something moving in the Pope's private chambers that defied explanation. Something with too many limbs and eyes that reflected light like a cat's. When Paolo didn't emerge by dawn, Marco went searching. He found the chapel empty, except for a small pool of what looked like black oil beneath the confessional booth. Cardinal Toretti claimed Paolo had simply been reassigned to other duties, but Marco knew better. Guards didn't disappear without word, especially not one scheduled for confession. The next week, it was Marco's turn. He approached the chapel with his ceremonial sword at his side and a recording device hidden beneath his uniform. The cardinal was waiting, his aged face kind but somehow wrong in the candlelight, as if the shadows fell differently across his features than they should. "My son," Toretti said, his voice carrying an odd resonance in the small space. "Please, enter the booth. Tell me what troubles your soul." Marco knelt in the confined space, the familiar ritual providing false comfort. Through the screen, he could see the cardinal's silhouette, but something about it seemed distorted, as if the man cast the shadow of something far larger and more angular than human. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," Marco began, following the ancient formula. But as he spoke, he noticed that his voice echoed strangely in the booth, as if the space was far larger than its physical dimensions. "Tell me of your fears," the cardinal whispered, and Marco felt compelled to speak truths he'd never intended to voice. "I fear that we are not guarding what we think we are guarding," Marco heard himself say. "I fear that the holiness of this place is a mask for something unholy. I fear that our oath of loyalty binds us to serve darkness rather than light." The cardinal's shadow shifted, growing larger against the confessional screen. "Continue, my son. Confession cleanses the soul." Against his will, Marco found himself describing everything. The strange sounds in the night, the way certain chambers felt wrong, the guards who had disappeared over the years and been explained away as transfers or retirements. As he spoke, he felt something inside him being drawn out, as if his words were more than mere sounds, as if they carried the essence of his soul with them. "And what," the cardinal asked, "do you believe lurks beneath our sacred halls?" Marco tried to stop speaking, but his mouth moved without his permission. "Something that feeds on faith itself. Something that grows stronger each time we swear our oaths. Each time we pledge our lives to protect what we think is holy. It's been here longer than the church, and it's turned our devotion into its sustenance." The recording device in his pocket had begun to emit a high-pitched whine, as if the very air was becoming charged with something inimical to technology. Through the confessional screen, Marco saw the cardinal's shadow expanding, its edges becoming sharp and predatory. "You understand," Toretti said, and his voice now came from multiple directions at once. "You see the truth. The Vatican is not built upon the tomb of St. Peter. It is built upon something far older, something that taught humanity the meaning of worship by demanding it absolutely." Marco tried to move, to flee, but found himself paralyzed. The confessional booth had become a trap, its walls pressing inward while simultaneously seeming to stretch into infinite darkness. The cardinal's shadow had become something resembling a massive spider, its limbs reaching through the screen to wrap around Marco's soul. "Your friend Paolo understood too late," the thing wearing Toretti's voice continued. "He tried to resist, tried to warn others. But confession requires honesty, and honesty makes one vulnerable to truth. The truth that your Swiss guard has never protected the Vatican. You have fed it." Marco felt pieces of himself being drawn away, his memories and faith becoming sustenance for something that existed between the spaces of reality. But his training had prepared him for this moment, even if he hadn't known it. With tremendous effort, he reached for the blessed silver cross that every guard wore, not the ceremonial one visible on his uniform, but the small, hidden one that was truly consecrated. The moment his fingers touched the silver, the illusion shattered. He found himself in a vast underground chamber, its walls lined with cocoon-like structures that pulsed with trapped light. Each cocoon contained the form of a Swiss guard, their faces peaceful but their bodies drained of color and substance. Paolo hung among them, still alive but fading, his essence being slowly consumed by the thing that had worn Cardinal Toretti's face for decades. The creature itself crouched at the chamber's center, a nightmare fusion of spider and shadow that fed through threads of darkness connected to each trapped soul. When it spoke, its voice was a mockery of the kind confessor Marco had known. "Silver burns, but faith sustains," it hissed. "And you have so much faith to offer." Marco drew his ceremonial sword, its blade inscribed with genuine prayers rather than mere decoration. The creature recoiled, as the weapon reflected candlelight that had never existed in this dark place. Light that came from somewhere beyond the physical realm. "I serve the true God," Marco declared, advancing despite his terror. "Not whatever corruption has taken root here." The battle that followed was unlike any earthly combat. Each swing of Marco's blessed blade cut through the threads connecting the creature to its victims, freeing guards who had been trapped for years. But with each liberation, the creature grew more desperate and dangerous, its form becoming less stable and more purely malevolent. The real Cardinal Toretti lay in the farthest cocoon, barely alive after decades of imprisonment, while his identity was worn like a mask. As Marco freed him, the old man whispered a final confession not to cleanse his soul, but to arm his rescuer with knowledge. The thing. It came with the building's foundation stones, Toretti gasped. "Every church built on unholy ground risks this. Faith concentrated becomes food for things that hunger for worship itself." With the last victim freed, the creature's form began to collapse, but its final words echoed through the chamber. "Others serve me still." The infestation spreads. Every confession heard in darkness, every oath sworn in shadow, "I am there," growing stronger. Marco emerged from the underground chamber to find the Vatican in chaos. Dawn was breaking, and with it came the discovery that Cardinal Toretti had been missing for nearly 40 years. The man who had worn his face was dissolving into shadow, even as Vatican security tried to comprehend what they were seeing. The official report blamed a gas leak for the hallucinations experienced by several guards. Marco was commended for his bravery in rescuing his comrades from the collapsed chamber, and the area was sealed permanently. But Marco knew the truth: the creature hadn't been destroyed, only driven deeper. And late at night, when the Vatican's halls are darkest, guards still report the sound of confession being heard in empty chapels, the whispered sins of the faithful being transformed into sustenance for something that wears the mask of holiness while feeding on the very souls it pretends to save. The Swiss guard's oath speaks of serving unto death. Marco learned that some oaths continue far beyond. Vatican City, 2003. The Holy See's most classified archive wasn't filled with scrolls or ancient texts. It was a single room containing a chair. And in that chair sat the thing that had once been Pope Celestine V, who had died over 700 years ago. Guard Sergeant Anna Kohler was the first woman to be assigned to the Apostolic Sentinel detail, and she would be the last person to see it before everything went wrong. The detail was considered both an honor and a punishment among the Swiss Guard. Only the most trusted guards were told of the Sentinel's existence, and those who served the rotation were sworn to absolute silence under penalty of excommunication and death. The cover story was simple. Certain archives required round-the-clock protection. The reality was something the Vatican had been containing since 1294. Anna had been briefed by Captain Brenner in a room that officially didn't exist, 3 levels below the Sistine Chapel. The walls were lined with lead and blessed silver, and the air carried the constant hum of machinery that maintained temperature, humidity, and something called spiritual pressure at precise levels. Pope Celestine V was a hermit who never wanted the papacy, Brenner explained, his voice carefully neutral. When he abdicated after 5 months, he returned to his cave to continue his religious contemplations. What he found there changed him. 3 years later, he was brought here for safekeeping. The captain led her to an observation window made of glass 6 inches thick. Beyond it lay a simple chamber furnished only with a medieval wooden chair, and in that chair sat a figure in papal robes that had not moved in over 7 centuries. "He is not dead," Brenner continued. "Nor is he truly alive. He exists in a state of constant prayer, and that prayer is the only thing keeping something far worse from entering our world. Your job is to watch him. If he stops praying, if his lips cease moving, if his eyes open, you sound the alarm immediately." The thing in the chair was impossibly ancient. Its skin like parchment stretched over bone. Its lips moved in constant, silent repetition of prayers in Latin, so archaic that only Vatican scholars could translate them. But it was the eyes that disturbed Anna most. Closed, but moving rapidly beneath paper-thin lids, as if witnessing horrors beyond human comprehension. "What happens if he stops praying?" Anna asked. Brenner's face went pale. "We've had 3 incidents in 7 centuries. Each time, reality itself began to bend around this facility. Things that shouldn't exist began manifesting in nearby rooms. The last time, in 1958, we lost 12 guards before containment was re-established. Their bodies were found turned inside out, but still alive and screaming." Anna's first week on the detail passed without incident. She sat in the observation post, watching the sentinels' lips move in their endless prayer, occasionally checking the monitoring equipment that tracked everything from brain activity to spiritual resonance. The other guards on the rotation, all men who'd served the detail for years, treated her with a mixture of respect and pity. They knew what the vigil could do to a person's mind. It was during her second week that Anna began to notice the dreams. They started as whispers in Latin, prayers that echoed through her sleep. But gradually, the prayers became pleas, and the pleas became warnings. She began to understand that the thing in the chair wasn't just praying, it was arguing, debating, negotiating with something that existed beyond the boundaries of reality itself. The dreams showed her glimpses of what lay on the other side of that negotiation. A realm where the very concepts of matter and energy had different meanings, where entities that had existed since before the universe's creation waited with infinite patience for an opportunity to remake reality according to their alien logic. The Sentinels' prayers weren't keeping them out, they were buying time, arguing for humanity's continued existence in a cosmic court that operated on principles beyond mortal understanding. But the dreams also showed her something else. The Sentinel was losing the argument. On her 15th day, Anna noticed a change in the monitoring equipment. The spiritual pressure readings were fluctuating, and the Sentinel's prayer rhythm had developed an almost imperceptible stutter. When she reported this to Captain Brenner, his reaction was immediate and terrifying. "Emergency Protocol 7, he ordered, and Anna found herself at the center of a crisis that the Vatican had spent centuries preparing for. Guards in hazmat suits flooded the observation chamber, while technicians worked frantically to stabilize the containment field. But Anna could see through the thick glass that their efforts were failing. The Sentinel's eyes were beginning to open. What lay behind those ancient lids was not the gaze of a human being, but windows into the void that existed between dimensions. As the eyes opened wider, the chamber beyond the glass began to change. The walls rippled like water, and impossible geometric shapes began manifesting in the air around the still praying figure. "He's not going to last much longer," one of the technicians reported. 700 years of constant prayer, his soul is exhausted. Whatever's coming through is wearing him down. Anna watched in fascination and horror as the thing that had once been Pope Celestine V began to transform. The ancient flesh was falling away like shed clothing, revealing something underneath that was part human saint and part cosmic guardian. The prayers that had been silent for centuries suddenly became audible, their Latin words carrying harmonics that made the observation chamber's glass crack. But Anna heard something else in those prayers, a message meant specifically for her. The Sentinel had been aware of her presence from the beginning, and in its final moments, it was passing along critical information. The cosmic entities weren't trying to invade reality, they were trying to escape from something else, something that existed in the spaces between their realm and ours, something that fed on the destruction of universes. The Sentinel's prayers had been holding the entities in place, preventing them from fleeing into our reality and bringing their pursuer with them. As the ancient guardian finally succumbed to centuries of exhaustion, Anna understood the terrible truth. The Vatican's greatest secret wasn't what they were keeping out, it was what they were keeping in. The entities on the other side weren't malevolent invaders but refugees, and humanity had been conscripted as their jailers without ever knowing it. The chamber beyond the glass exploded into chaos as reality itself began to unravel. The monitoring equipment screamed warnings about dimensional breaches and spiritual contamination, while the walls of the Vatican above them began to crack and shift. But Anna also saw something else. Other figures materializing in the chamber, wearing the robes and bearing the faces of long-dead popes and saints. They had come to replace the fallen sentinel. The newly arrived guardians took up position around the empty chair, their voices joining in the eternal prayer that held reality together. But Anna could see that they were weaker than their predecessor. Their spiritual essence spread thinner across the cosmic battlefield. The next crisis would come sooner, and when it did, humanity would need to be ready to make a choice that would define the fate of existence itself. As order was restored and the chamber resealed, Anna found herself promoted to the position of detail commander. Her new job was to recruit and train the next generation of guards, but also to prepare them for the day when prayer alone would no longer be enough. The Swiss Guard's oath spoke of defending the Holy See against all enemies. Anna learned that the greatest enemies were the ones humanity had been forced to protect, and the greatest defenders were the ones who sacrificed their souls to pray for a universe that would never know what horrors they held at bay. In her final report, classified at levels beyond papal authority, Anna wrote, "The Sentinel is eternal, but the souls that fuel it are not. We estimate approximately 50 years before total containment failure. Recommend immediate research into alternative binding methods and preparation for full disclosure protocols." The Vatican has been counting down ever since. Vatican City, 2016. The conclave to elect the new pope was unlike any in the Church's history, and Swiss Guard commander Erich Zimmermann was beginning to understand why. For 3 weeks, 117 cardinals had been sealed within the Sistine Chapel, their deliberations protected by centuries of tradition and the absolute security of the Swiss Guard. But tradition couldn't explain why no smoke had emerged from the chapel's chimney for the past 72 hours, or why the cardinals inside had stopped responding to any form of communication. It began on the 17th day of deliberation. The cardinals had been arguing over a candidate whose name didn't appear in any official Vatican records, someone they referred to only as the shepherd of the final flock. When pressed for details, the senior cardinals became evasive, speaking in hushed tones about prophecies and responsibilities that transcended earthly concerns. Commander Zimmermann had tried to dismiss these oddities as the product of exhaustion and spiritual fervor. Conclaves were always intense affairs, and the weight of choosing Christ's representative on earth could drive even the most rational men to extremes. But when Cardinal Bertoli collapsed during what should have been a routine ballot, muttering about the one who comes before the ending, Zimmermann knew something was fundamentally wrong. The medical team that examined Bertoli found no physical cause for his collapse, but the cardinal's blood work revealed anomalies that defied explanation. His cellular structure showed signs of rapid aging, as if decades of life had been compressed into hours. More disturbing were the traces of an unknown substance in his bloodstream, something that registered on no known periodic table but caused laboratory equipment to malfunction in its presence. That night, Zimmermann assembled his most trusted guards for an emergency briefing in the Apostolic Palace's secure communications room. The men who answered his call were veterans of the Swiss Guard's most classified operations, soldiers who had sworn oaths that went beyond mere service to include the protection of secrets that could shatter faith itself. "Gentlemen," Zimmermann began, "what I'm about to tell you is classified at the level of papal confession. The conclave has been compromised, but not by any earthly force." He activated a secure display that showed thermal imaging of the Sistine Chapel's interior. Where there should have been 117 distinct heat signatures, the screen showed something impossible, a single, massive presence that pulsed with temperatures far exceeding human norms, surrounded by smaller figures that barely registered as alive. 12 hours ago, our monitoring equipment detected a spiritual anomaly within the chapel, Zimmermann continued. The electromagnetic signature suggests the presence of something that exists primarily in dimensions beyond our normal perception. Whatever is in there with the cardinals, it's not human. Guard Lieutenant Sarah Weber raised her hand. As one of the few women in the Swiss Guard's inner circle, She had earned her position through exceptional skill in both combat and theological studies. "Sir, are we talking about possession? Demonic influence?" Zimmerman's expression grew grave. "Something far more sophisticated. Our theological consultants believe we're dealing with an entity that has been manipulating the conclave from within church hierarchy itself. The candidate they keep discussing, the shepherd of the final flock, doesn't exist in any official records, but references to this figure appear in suppressed texts dating back to the church's founding." He pulled up another display, showing pages from manuscripts that had been locked in the Vatican's most secret archives for over a millennium. The Latin text was illuminated with images that hurt to look at, directly depictions of a figure that wore papal robes but cast the shadow of something with wings and too many eyes. "According to these sources," Zimmerman explained, "there have always been two lines of papal succession: the public line that leads the visible church, and a hidden line that prepares for what the texts call the final ministry. Every few centuries, circumstances align to allow the hidden pope to emerge and claim his true authority." The guards studied the thermal imaging with growing unease. The massive presence in the chapel was moving now, circling the barely living cardinals in patterns that resembled a ritual dance more than human movement. "What are our orders, sir?" asked Sergeant Klaus Richter, a man whose family had served the Swiss Guard for 7 generations. "We breached the chapel," Zimmerman replied. "Whatever's happening in there ends tonight, even if we have to drag every cardinal out by force." But as they prepared their equipment, the chapel's massive wooden doors opened from within. Cardinal Torriani emerged, his face serene but his eyes completely black. Behind him came others, moving in perfect synchronization, their crimson robes somehow darker than they had been when the conclave began. "Commander," Torriani said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to echo from multiple throats, "the conclave has reached its decision. We have chosen our new shepherd." The cardinals arranged themselves in formation, creating a pathway that led back into the chapel's depths. From within came the sound of something massive moving, accompanied by a low chanting in a language that predated Latin. The air itself began to thicken, taking on a quality that made breathing difficult and thinking even harder. "I need to see the ballots," Zimmerman demanded, though his training told him that protocol had become irrelevant. "The election must be verified according to canon law." "Canon law," Cardinal Torriani replied, "was written for the earthly phase of the Church's existence. We have entered the final phase, and different rules apply." The thing that emerged from the Sistine Chapel wore the traditional white robes of the papacy, but the body beneath them was not human. It moved with impossible grace, its limbs bending at angles that defied anatomy. Where its face should have been was a void that contained swirling galaxies of stars that were dying or being born. When it spoke, the words came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I am the shepherd of the final flock," it announced. "I have waited centuries for this moment, when the barriers between heaven and earth grow thin enough for my true ministry to begin." Zimmerman's hand went to his weapon, but found his muscles unresponsive. The entity's presence was overwhelming his nervous system, rewriting the basic electrical impulses that controlled movement and thought. Around him, his guards stood frozen, their eyes reflecting the impossible starlight that poured from the new pope's void-like face. "Do not fear," the entity continued. "Your service to the church has prepared you for this moment. You will become the vanguard of the final ministry, helping to guide humanity through its transformation into something worthy of cosmic communion." Through tremendous effort, Zimmerman managed to activate the emergency beacon hidden in his uniform. Its signal would alert Vatican security, Swiss intelligence, and ultimately the global network of church defenders that had operated in secret since the Crusades. But he realized that the entity had allowed him this small act of defiance, seeing it not as resistance but as cooperation. "Yes," the false pope whispered, "summon them all. Let every guardian of faith come to witness the revelation. The time of hiding is over." The cardinals began their procession out of the chapel, but their movement was wrong. They walked in perfect unison, their feet not quite touching the ground. As they passed each guard, Zimmerman saw their true nature revealed. These were not the men who had entered the conclave 3 weeks ago. They were shells, their souls replaced by fragments of something vast and alien that wore human form like a disguise. Lieutenant Weber managed to break free from the entity's paralysis long enough to draw her ceremonial sword. The blessed silver blade gleamed as she struck at the nearest cardinal, but her weapon passed through him as if he were made of smoke. The cardinal turned to face her, his mouth opening to reveal rows of teeth that belonged to no earthly creature. Faith without understanding is merely fear, the cardinal that had been Torriani explained. We offer understanding. We offer transformation. We offer an end to the loneliness that has plagued your species since it first looked up at the stars and realized how small it was. The entity in papal robes raised what might have been a hand, and Weber found herself lifted into the air. But instead of harming her, it began to show her visions, glimpses of what humanity could become under its guidance. Cities that spanned dimensions, technologies that operated on principles of faith made manifest, a future where the boundaries between physical and spiritual reality had been dissolved entirely. Beautiful, Weber whispered, tears streaming down her face. It's beautiful. But Zimmerman saw something else in the visions, the cost of such transformation. Humanity would survive, but it would no longer be human. Every soul would become part of a vast collective consciousness, individual identity dissolving into something greater but utterly alien. The entity offered evolution, but evolution that would erase everything that made human existence meaningful. As Vatican security forces surrounded the Sistine Chapel, Zimmerman realized the terrible truth. The Swiss Guard's ultimate duty was not to protect the Pope, it was to protect the world from what the Church might become if it fully embraced its cosmic destiny. The organization he had served his entire life was not humanity's guardian, but its potential destroyer, and the choice of what came next lay in the hands of soldiers who had sworn oaths to both God and man. The false Pope smiled with its void-like face as armed figures poured into St. Peter's Square. Each new arrival represented another soul that could be transformed, another step toward the final ministry that would either damn humanity or save it from its own limitations. Commander Zimmerman looked at his paralyzed guards, at the cardinals who were no longer human, at the entity that claimed to be the Church's true spiritual authority. The choice was simple and impossible. Serve the oath he had sworn to protect the Holy See, or serve the deeper oath he had sworn to protect humanity itself. The radio crackled with reports from around the world, similar entities appearing in cathedrals and churches, congregations transforming en masse, faith itself becoming a weapon of cosmic change. The final ministry was not limited to the Vatican. It was global, universal, inevitable. As dawn broke over Vatican City, Erich Zimmerman made his choice. He would serve both oaths, even if it destroyed him. The Swiss Guard would protect humanity from the Church, and protect the Church from itself, until someone could find a third option that neither side had considered. The unholy conclave had chosen its pope. Now humanity would have to choose its future. Based on whispered legends from the Vatican's darkest corridors, the cobblestones of San Damaso courtyard gleamed wet under the pale moonlight as Sergeant Klaus Zimmerman adjusted his ceremonial halberd for what felt like the 100th time that night. 3 months into his service with the Pontifical Swiss Guard, he had grown accustomed to the weight of tradition that pressed down upon the Vatican like a shroud. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the very stones seemed to whisper. "First time on the midnight watch?" asked Corporal Benedetti, his Italian accent thick with something that might have been sympathy. The older guard's weathered face carried the lines of a man who had seen too many sleepless nights within these ancient walls. Klaus nodded, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. The recruitment process had been rigorous, unmarried Catholic men under 30, Swiss citizenship, military training. They had prepared him for the physical demands, the ceremonial duties, even the occasional security threat. But no one had prepared him for the weight of history that seemed to seep from every carved angel, every whispered prayer, echoing through the corridors at ungodly hours. "You'll hear things," Benedetti continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Old stones, remember, Capice? 500 years of secrets, of sins, of other things. The walls, they speak to those who listen too closely." As if summoned by his words, a sound echoed across the courtyard, not quite footsteps, but a rhythmic scratching, like claws on stone. Klaus turned toward the source, his hand instinctively tightening on his weapon. What was that? Benedetti's face had gone pale in the moonlight. Probably nothing. The Vatican is old, full of rats and old things that skitter in the dark. But Klaus, he grabbed the younger man's arm with surprising strength. Whatever you hear tonight, whatever you see, you never speak of it. Not to the other guards, not to your family back in Zurich, not even to your confessor. Some secrets die with the man who carries them. The scratching came again, closer this time, accompanied by what sounded almost like breathing. Heavy, labored breathing that seemed to echo from the very walls themselves. Klaus had been assigned to patrol the eastern corridor of the Apostolic Palace, a route that took him past some of the Vatican's most closely guarded chambers. The Swiss Guard had protected these halls since 1506, and Klaus had memorized every story of heroism and sacrifice. What the histories didn't mention were the other stories, the ones that lived only in hushed conversations and knowing glances between veteran guards. As he walked his route, Klaus noticed something odd about his shadow. Under the flickering torchlight that illuminated the ancient frescoes, his shadow seemed wrong. Too long, with edges that moved independently of his body. He stopped walking and watched as his shadow continued for 3 more steps before freezing, as if caught in the act of betrayal. "Mein Gott," he whispered, and immediately regretted breaking the silence. His voice echoed strangely, returning to him distorted, as if it had passed through something thick and unwholesome before bouncing back. That's when he heard the singing. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of his own heartbeat, which had begun to pound with increasing urgency. A woman's voice, pure and ethereal, singing what sounded like a Latin hymn. But as Klaus listened more closely, the words seemed wrong. The melody was familiar, he recognized it as Ave Maria, but the lyrics were inverted, corrupted, speaking not of salvation but of something far darker. The voice was coming from behind a heavy wooden door marked with symbols he didn't recognize. His training told him to report any unusual activity, but something deeper, some primal instinct told him to run. Instead, he found himself drawn closer, his hand reaching for the ancient iron handle. The door opened at his touch, revealing a spiral staircase that descended into absolute darkness. The singing grew stronger, more urgent, and Klaus realized with growing horror that it wasn't just one voice, it was dozens, maybe hundreds, all harmonizing in perfect, terrible unity. Against every rational thought, every protocol he'd learned, Klaus began to descend. The stairs seemed to go on forever, spiraling deeper and deeper into the earth beneath the Vatican. The walls changed as he descended, becoming rougher, more ancient. These weren't the carefully maintained passages of the modern Vatican. These were something far older, dating perhaps to the original foundations, or even before. The singing stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, Klaus could hear his own breathing, sharp and panicked, and something else, a rustling, like fabric against stone. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he began to make out shapes in the shadows, figures in white robes, standing motionless against the walls. At first, he thought they were statues, but as he watched, one of them turned its head toward him with a grinding sound like stone against bone. "You shouldn't be here," the figure whispered, and its voice was the voice from the song, pure, ethereal, and absolutely wrong. "This place is for the lost ones, the forgotten ones, the ones who served and were discarded." Klaus tried to speak, but his voice wouldn't come. The figure stepped away from the wall, and he could see that what he had taken for white robes were actually the remnants of Swiss Guard uniforms, yellowed with age and stained with something dark. The face beneath the tattered cap was gaunt, the eyes hollow sockets that seemed to reflect light that wasn't there. "We have waited so long for a brother to join us," another voice whispered. And Klaus realized the other figures were moving now, detaching themselves from the walls with that same horrible grinding sound. So long in the darkness, keeping the deepest secrets, guarding the final truth. Klaus found his voice, though it came out as barely a croak. "What truth?" The figures laughed, a sound like wind through a cemetery. "The truth of what lies beneath the city of God. The truth of what we guard against. The truth of why the Swiss Guard's real duty has nothing to do with protecting the Pope." One of the figures raised what had once been a halberd, now rusted and twisted into something that looked more like an instrument of torture than a weapon. Some secrets require permanent guardians. Klaus turned and ran. He took the stairs 3 at a time, his lungs burning as he climbed toward the surface. Behind him, he could hear pursuit, not footsteps, but that same grinding, scratching sound, accompanied by whispered prayers, in a language that predated Latin, predated Christianity, predated anything human. He burst through the door at the top of the stairs and slammed it behind him, fumbling for his radio to call for backup. But as he pressed the call button, he realized that the corridor around him was wrong. The frescoes were different, darker, depicting scenes that belonged in no Christian art. The ceiling was lower, oppressive, and the air tasted of copper and decay. This wasn't the Apostolic Palace. This was somewhere else entirely. Klaus ran through corridors that seemed to stretch and contract like living things, past doors that opened onto rooms filled with impossible geometries and shadows that moved with their own purpose. He could hear the singing again, coming from everywhere and nowhere, growing louder with each step. Finally, he saw a light ahead, blessed, normal electric light. He ran toward it and found himself bursting into the familiar sight of the guardhouse, where Corporals Benedetti and Mueller were playing cards at a table lit by a simple desk lamp. Both men looked up as he stumbled in, gasping and wild-eyed. "Klaus," Benedetti stood slowly, his face grave. "Where have you been? You missed your check-in 3 hours ago." 3 hours? Klaus checked his watch, but the face was cracked, the hands frozen at midnight, the time he had begun his descent. "I was only down there for minutes. The stairs, the singing, the dead guards." "What stairs?" Mueller asked, but his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Benedetti moved to Klaus's side, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. "There are no stairs in the eastern corridor, Klaus. Just solid stone walls that have been there for 5 centuries. Klaus stared at him in disbelief. "But I saw them. I heard them singing. They tried to make me join them." "Join whom?" Benedetti's voice was gentle but firm. "The dead Swiss guards, the ones who found the truth and were kept as guardians." Benedetti and Mueller exchanged a look that Klaus recognized. He had seen it before, in the faces of veteran guards, when new recruits asked too many questions about certain parts of the Vatican, certain duties that weren't discussed in official briefings. "Klaus," Benedetti said carefully, "what exactly do you think you saw down there?" As Klaus began to recount his experience, he noticed that Mueller had quietly moved to the guardhouse window. The man was looking out at the courtyard, but his posture was tense, alert, as if he was watching for something. "The truth," Klaus finished. "They said they were guarding the truth about what lies beneath the Vatican." The room fell silent. Benedetti released Klaus's shoulder and returned to his seat, but he didn't pick up his cards. Instead, he stared at the table for a long moment before speaking. "Some truths," he said slowly, "are too dangerous for one man to carry alone. That's why we have the Swiss Guard, not to protect the Pope from earthly threats, but to ensure that certain knowledge stays buried." Klaus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "What knowledge?" Mueller turned from the window, his face grim. "The kind that drove good men mad. The kind that turned faithful servants into other things. Things that still wander the deep places, singing their warnings to anyone foolish enough to listen." "You're telling me that what I saw was real?" "I'm telling you," Benedetti said, "that there are aspects of our duty here that aren't covered in training. And now that you've seen them." He trailed off, seeming to struggle with his words. Klaus looked between the two men, understanding dawning on him like a cold sunrise. "I can't leave, can I?" Mueller smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, you can leave, Klaus. But the knowledge you carry now, that's different. That stays here, one way or another." As if summoned by his words, Klaus heard it again, the singing, faint but unmistakable, drifting up from somewhere far below. This time, however, he realized that both Benedetti and Mueller were humming along, their voices harmonizing with the ethereal chorus in perfect, practiced unity. "Welcome to the real Swiss Guard, Brother Klaus," Benedetti said, and his voice carried the same pure, ethereal quality Klaus had heard in the depths. "Your true service begins now." Klaus tried to run again, but the guardhouse door had no handle on the inside. The window showed not the familiar courtyard, but an endless expanse of dark stone corridors stretching into infinity. And still the singing continued, growing stronger, calling him to join the eternal watch. The last entry in the official logs of the Swiss Guard recorded that Sergeant Klaus Zimmermann had requested early termination of his service due to personal reasons. But those who knew where to look could find other records, older records, written in a careful hand that dated back centuries. These records spoke of guardians who served not the Pope, but something far older and more terrible that slumbered in the deepest foundations of the Holy See. And sometimes, late at night, new recruits reported hearing singing from empty corridors, voices raised in prayer for salvation that would never come, and warning of truths that were never meant to be known. A document discovered sealed within the Vatican secret archives, personal statement of Captain Ernst Weiss, Pontifical Swiss Guard. Date: October 30. Honest, 1978. Classification: Secretum Pontificum. This account is written with full knowledge that it may never see light beyond these walls. I commit these words to paper not for posterity, but for my own sanity, and as a warning to those who may one day face what I have faced. May God forgive me for what I have seen, and for what I have failed to prevent. I have served the Swiss Guard for 15 years with distinction, rising through the ranks to command one of the most elite security forces in the world. In that time, I have protected 3 popes, thwarted assassination attempts, and maintained the sacred trust placed in our order since 1506. I believed I understood the full scope of our duties. I was wrong. It began with the installation of the new surveillance system in the Apostolic Palace. Modern technology was finally being integrated into our ancient methods: cameras, motion sensors, infrared detection. As captain, I was given access to the master control room, a sterile chamber filled with monitors showing every corridor, every chamber, every sacred space within our protection. The technician who installed the system was a nervous Italian named Rossini, good Catholic, clean background check. But there was something in his eyes when he handed over the final documentation, a fear that went deeper than the usual awe people felt in the presence of such sacred surroundings. "Captain Weiss," he said, his hands shaking as he gathered his tools. "There were some irregularities during the installation." "What kind of irregularities?" He glanced around the control room as if the walls themselves might be listening. "The cameras in the sub-basements levels B, 3, and below. They're functioning, but..." He pulled out a tablet and showed me a series of technical readouts. "The equipment keeps malfunctioning in the same pattern. Every night at 3:17 a.m., the cameras go offline for exactly 17 minutes. All of them, simultaneously. Equipment failure? That's what I thought at first. But look at this." He swiped to another screen showing thermal imaging data. Right before the cameras fail, the temperature in those areas drops by 30 degrees. Instantly. That's not possible with any known HVAC system. I studied the data, my military training demanding logical explanations. What levels are we talking about? Sections that aren't supposed to exist, according to the official building plans, Rossini whispered. But the ground, penetrating radar, shows vast chambers beneath the foundation chambers that predate the construction of the Vatican by centuries. After Rossini left, I spent hours reviewing the surveillance footage from the previous weeks. Most of it was exactly what I expected: empty corridors, the occasional late-night maintenance worker, priests moving silently through their nocturnal duties. But when I focused on the sub-basement cameras, patterns began to emerge that defied explanation. At exactly 3:17 a.m. each morning, the cameras would begin to malfunction, but not all at once. It started with the deepest level B7, according to the system, and moved upward in a precise sequence. But in the moments before each camera went dark, they captured images that made my blood run cold. Figures in white robes moving through corridors that shouldn't exist, not walking, gliding, as if their feet never touched the stone floor. Their faces were hidden beneath deep hoods, but occasionally one would look up directly at the camera, and I would catch a glimpse of features that were wrong. Too angular, too pale, with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. The most disturbing footage came from camera B47, positioned at the end of a corridor that led to what the building plans claimed was solid rock. The camera showed a massive door made of some black material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And every night, At the peak of the malfunction period, that door would slowly open, revealing not a room beyond but an absolute darkness that seemed to move with its own purpose. From that darkness, more figures would emerge. I decided to investigate personally. The official building plans showed the Apostolic Palace extending only 2 levels below ground storage areas and mechanical systems. But armed with the surveillance data, I found access points that had been carefully concealed behind false walls and sealed doorways. Using my master keys and security clearance, I began to explore. The first 3 sublevels were exactly as documented storage rooms, electrical systems, the normal infrastructure of a large building. But hidden behind a maintenance panel on B3, I found another stairway, this one carved directly into the living rock. The stairs were old, far older than the Vatican itself, and showed signs of regular use despite being completely absent from any official records. I descended with only a flashlight and my sidearm, though I had no idea what good conventional weapons might do against whatever I was investigating. The temperature dropped with each level, just as Rossini's equipment had indicated, and the air grew thick with the scent of incense and something else, something organic and unpleasant. At B7, I found the first chamber. It was vast, larger than the Sistine Chapel, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into darkness above my flashlight beam. The walls were covered in frescoes, but these were unlike any Christian art I had ever seen. The imagery was ancient, predating Christianity, depicting figures that were both human and something else entirely. In the center of the chamber stood an altar, not the clean marble of a church altar, but something carved from black stone and stained with substances I didn't want to identify. But it was what surrounded the altar that nearly broke my sanity. Hundreds of Swiss guards, standing at perfect attention in concentric circles around the black stone. Their uniforms were from different eras, some wearing the traditional costume I knew, others in variations that dated back centuries. All of them were perfectly preserved, as if death was merely a temporary inconvenience they had learned to overcome. As I watched in terror, one of them turned toward me. Captain Dietrich Kellner. According to the nameplate on his uniform, I recognized him from historical records. He had served under Pope Pius IX and died in 1863. His face was exactly as described in contemporary accounts, except for the eyes, which held an intelligence far too alert for a man dead over a century. "Captain Weiss," he said, and his voice carried perfect command authority despite coming from lungs that should have been dust generations ago. "We have been waiting for you." I tried to run, but found that my legs wouldn't obey. Some force held me in place as the circle of dead guards began to move, not toward me, but in a slow, ceremonial rotation around the altar. "You have seen too much," another voice said. This came from a guard whose uniform I didn't recognize, older than the others, maybe dating to the earliest days of our order. "Just as we all saw too much. Just as we all learned the truth about our real purpose here." "What truth?" The words came out as a croak. Captain Kellner smiled, and I saw that his teeth were stained black. "The Vatican is not what the world believes it to be, Ernst. Oh, it serves God. Certainly, but which God? The God of love and mercy preached in the cathedrals above? Or the older God that dwells in the foundations, the God that requires different forms of worship?" The circle of guards had begun to chant in a language I didn't recognize, their voices creating harmonies that made my skin crawl. As they chanted, the altar began to change, the black stone becoming translucent, revealing something moving within something vast and patient and terribly aware. "The Swiss Guard exists to protect the Vatican's secrets," the ancient guard continued. "All of its secrets. Not just from external threats, but from the Vatican itself. There are those above who must never know what lies beneath. There are truths that would shatter the faith of millions if they were revealed. And so we serve," Captain Kellner added. "Even in death, we serve. We guard the deepest chambers. We contain the oldest truths, and we ensure that the thing that sleeps beneath never wakes." The chanting reached a crescendo, and I felt my will slipping away, my mind beginning to merge with the collective consciousness of the Eternal Guard. But at the last moment, training kicked in, not military training, but something deeper. The prayers my grandmother had taught me as a child, the simple faith that had brought me to this place of service. "Vater unser I am Himmel," I whispered. and the effect was immediate. The chanting faltered, the circle wavered, and I felt control return to my limbs. I ran. Behind me, I could hear pursuit, not the clank of armor or the sound of boots on stone, but a whispered wind that carried voices speaking my name, calling me back to join the eternal watch. I climbed stairs that seemed to multiply as I ascended, passed through corridors that shifted and changed when I wasn't looking directly at them. When I finally emerged onto ground level, gasping and wild-eyed, I found myself in the familiar surroundings of the guardhouse. Sergeant Hoffman was at his desk, writing reports by lamplight. "Captain?" He looked up with concern. "Sir, where have you been? You've been missing for 18 hours. 18 hours. My watch showed the same time I had entered the sub-basement 3:17 a.m. But Sergeant Hoffman's clock showed 9:30 p.m. of the following day. I tried to explain what I had seen, but the words wouldn't come. Each time I attempted to describe the chambers, the dead guards, the thing in the altar, my voice would fail. My memory would blur. It was as if some force was preventing me from sharing what I had witnessed. That was 3 days ago. Since then, I have tried to investigate further, but every entrance to the sub-basements that I found has been sealed with what appears to be solid stone. The surveillance system still shows the malfunctions, but now the cameras reveal only empty corridors and bare rock where the chambers used to be. But I know they're still there. I know the Eternal Guard still maintains their vigil in the deep places, and I know that one day they will come for me, just as they come for every captain who learns too much. I am writing this account as a warning and as a confession. To whoever finds this document, if anyone ever finds it, know that the Swiss Guard serves purposes that go far beyond what the world understands. We are not just protectors of the Pope and guardians of the Vatican's treasures. We are the keepers of secrets that predate Christianity itself. We are the final barrier between the world above and the things that wait in the darkness below. And sometimes, when the regular guard is not enough, when the secrets threaten to escape their ancient bonds, we join the Eternal Watch. I can hear them calling me now, the voices of my predecessors, my brothers in service, welcoming me to the final duty. The surveillance monitors show nothing, but I know they are there, waiting in chambers that exist between the official levels, in spaces that appear on no maps. My time as a living guardian is ending. My service as something more is about to begin. If you are reading this, you are likely my successor. You will face the same choice I faced, the same choice every captain has faced for 5 centuries. You can remain ignorant and serve faithfully in the light above, or you can seek the truth and join us in the eternal darkness below. Choose wisely. Some knowledge, once gained, can never be forgotten. Some duties, once accepted, last far beyond a single mortal lifetime. And remember, the Swiss Guard's motto is not just words. Acriter et fideliter, fiercely and faithfully. That oath applies to all our duties, both those acknowledged in the light and those that must be carried out in the deepest shadows. The surveillance cameras have just malfunctioned again. It is 3:17 a.m. They are coming for me now. The document ends here. According to Vatican records, Captain Ernst Weiss requested early retirement on November 1st, 1978, citing personal and spiritual concerns. He was granted an honorable discharge and left Rome immediately. However, according to Swiss civil records, no one by that name ever returned to Switzerland, and no trace of Ernst Weiss has been found despite extensive investigation by his family. A handwritten note appears at the bottom of the document in different ink. The Eternal Guard welcomes all who have served faithfully. The watch continues. E.W., Captain of the Deep Guard, Anno Domini 1978 Hevery.